Okay, so my first official act is director of the Social Mobility Lab, and kicking off the summit is asking people to move forward, which I know is not going to ingratiate myself to your well wishes, but I've been asked for optics of filming and pictures to sort of just try to fill in a little bit. It also means people coming late will be able to sort of just sneak in the back. All right, now I feel particularly bad because I've just asked our dean to move up too, so sorry about that, Marc. Okay, so giving people a minute to get settled. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our second annual Social Mobility Lab Summit. We are excited for you to be here. It's a Monday morning after a long weekend, so we know it's difficult to carve this much time out of your day, so as much of it you can make, we really appreciate. I want to start, actually, where most people end. After a production like this, whether it's a movie or whatever, you see the credits roll at the end, which is unfortunate because it means that all the people who actually made something possible, people are sort of streaming out. And they don't get proper credit. And any kind of event like this, and also the work generally of the lab, is only made possible because of a lot of people doing really wonderful hard work and sacrificing. And also by doing the credits early also means if I forget someone, I have other opportunities to add them later. So I've got that going for me. So the first thing I want to start is this is a technical production. So I want to thank our tech crew over there who got in here early and set things up. Applause. There you go. It's good to have some good energy in the room. Okay, I would also like to thank our communications team. I don't know how many of them are here, but Jose, Namrata, Ari, who may be out in the back. Big congrats. Not only for helping sort of design these presentations and all the materials you see, but you also, which I'll talk about later, have something called the Journal of Up on Your Seats, which was designed internally, and it's a beautiful publication and a really sort of wonderful example of the quality of the work that our communications does every day. And so I really appreciate them as well. Where's Abby? Abby, thank you very much for all the work you do to support Wise Counsel there. Kevin, also Wise Counsel. These two help navigate the ins and outs of the Colin Powell School and City College, which is someone who is not sort of from and within academia, sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. So I really appreciate all of the Wise Counsel day in, day out they provide. Daniel, I don't know if he's here. Daniel is so wonderful in making sure things happen all throughout Colin Powell School and all the events, and this one included, so appreciate all of his time at Devotion. Hannah, you are here. Hannah's a research assistant. You're going to see her words in that journal a lot. And our other research assistant, Liberty Gonzalez, I don't think is here today, but they really do a lot of wonderful, important work to try to distill what we're doing and make it more accessible to others. I want to thank Pierre, who's sitting right here, the associate director of the lab, who is really willing and able to do anything above and beyond the call of service. So I also noticed that we've stopped applauding after the tech crew. So if we could just quickly catch up for all the people I just mentioned before. I would also like to thank the folks who have served other roles. We have an advisory committee many members are here, and so they attend our brown bag lunches, they review grants, they play a really important role for making our work move forward. There we go. Thank you. You will hear from our current grantees, you will meet our new grantees, and then there are some past grantees here. And obviously the learning that they produce is so critical to the lab. So thank you all for attending and for the wonderful work that you're doing to advance social mobility for people in our community and beyond. I would also like to thank the leadership within City College and the Colin Powell School. I will introduce our president, Vince Boudreau, in a moment. Dee Dee, thank you for also coming here today. And our dean, Marc Ostfield, who will close us out later today. But obviously, the support they provide to the lab in terms of making this center to the work of City College and the Colin Powell School is critical. And it is, I literally almost did sort of a Bette Midler reference, like Wind Beneath Our Wings, but which I guess I just did passive aggressively. So there you go. They're the wind beneath our wings. So thank you for all of that. I also want to thank the people who make the work possible in another fashion, which is sort of funding this support. So there are representatives from Kyndryl here. Were they? There we go. Thank you very much. And we've got a representative from the Gambrell Foundation. Thank you very much, Melissa, for joining us. And I think we may have online some folks from the Friedman Family Foundation. So thank you so much for joining us, the work that you do, and the support, not only in terms of the financial support, but also the counsel, and the motivation is really sort of critical to the work that we do. I also finally want to thank, and maybe give the most credit to, in all deference to everyone else, the students who are in this room, and the students who aren't in this room. And so the work that we do at the Social Mobility Lab is to create more of it for not only our students, but the communities they represent at City College and beyond. And so we'll hear from two of them today who will come up here and bravely share parts of their journey, and others will be here in person and online. So again, a big shout out to our students and the work that they do every day for themselves and their families. Okay, so let's get this party started. So just a quick sort of review of where we are. I'm going to introduce Vince to give welcoming remarks in a second. I'll come back and talk a little bit about the lab and the work that we're doing. We're going to hear first from one student to sort of kick us off. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, experiments in translation, which is what we're calling it, sort of different things we've been sort of working with in the lab over the last year. We will then go into sort of the first of 3 grantee presentations, where a group of 2 grantees will sort of present and share their new work. And then we'll pause and ask questions and reflect about sort of like, what did they just say mean something that I want someone else to know about, or that we want to do something about. And so there's a very active participant role where you will be providing us with ideas where hopefully we can sort of advance social mobility. And we'll take a break for lunch, and then we'll come back, get kicked off by some inspiring words from another student, and then repeat that process with 2 grantees. And then we'll have closing remarks from Dean Ostfield. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for your patience in my opening, non-opening, closing remarks. And I would like to now welcome to the stage President Vince Boudreau.
You know, this time of year, I spend a lot of time in Albany. We have these big CUNY events where, you know, presidents from all the different campuses come, and they fill a room with students and elected officials. And there's, you know, all through the day, people are being introduced. And whoever's at the microphone always says, please hold your applause until we've introduced everybody, and nobody ever does. And so I don't know what magic you managed to capture in this room, Bob, but we'll try to bring it to Albany for the next time we all gather. Listen, I'm thrilled about this event. I'm thrilled about it for a number of reasons. And the first is, you know, there really is no aspect of the work that we do at City College that has more fidelity to our founding vision than the work we do around social mobility. Like, if you think about why we exist, why we were judged to be necessary 180 years ago, and why we're still necessary today, it's the act of creating social mobility in the people that come to this campus. And it's particularly important. Now, you think about the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the economic climate, the demographics of the United States, the legacy of the Great Migration meant that social mobility was a kind of robust fact of social and political life in the United States. That simply is not the case anymore. It's just not. When I talk, you know, especially to alumni, when I talk to them about the value proposition of City College and why they should be supporting it, I mean, there's 2 things that really matter, I think, in those conversations. And the first is recognizing that some of the people in one of those alumni rooms will have graduated in 1949 and 1951 and all the way through to them. There's this kind of idea of, you know, the old City College and the new City College, right? When we were judged to be and talked about as the Harvard of the working class. And then, you know, that has changed through the years, and it particularly changed. Some of them just simply can't get over the idea of open admissions. They just can't. And what social mobility tells us is whatever it is you see when you look at the history of City College, whatever you see when you see the demographic change of our student body, which, by the way, is not the first demographic change we've ever had, right? We have been changing demographically since our founding. whatever you see, the work and the accomplishments of the college in terms of social mobility, in terms of providing a future for the people that come to this campus, is absolutely continuous over the years. And so the social mobility data that we use to celebrate the current accomplishments of the college, and just to remind those of you that have forgotten the original Raj Chetty publication, we were the #2 institution in the nation, behind this outfit that trains you to be a pilot at LaGuardia. You see it as you're going, right, in the nation, in doing exactly the thing that we were founded to do. And exactly the thing that the alumni of, the post-World War II period talked about as being so unique and so special about the institution. So that's the first thing that's important. The second thing that's important today is that social mobility doesn't exist in most of this country. When I talk to alumni, the thing I say to them about social mobility is that most of America, if you are born poor, you will live poor and you will die poor. And there are some few exceptions of this. Kevin Foster called our attention to the fact that one of the places that are an exception to that rule is in general on the campuses of public universities in the United States, typically not the flagship, typically not University of Michigan or Berkeley, but the other institutions down the line in their structures. And by that calculus, nobody does that work better than City College. Degree Choices has us in the last valuation. We are the #1 national public university in the nation in producing social mobility in our graduates. They call City College, even though we're a college, a national university because of our PhD. So that's the community that we kind of run in and are measured against. And so you think about what our nation would be today. You think about all of the kind of consequences of stymied and blocked avenues to social mobility and what it means for vast numbers of our population to see no future for themselves within the mainstream institutions of American life, our political institutions, our social institutions, our economic institutions, and what it would be for democracy if there was that pathway, if the kind of prospects for social mobility that we open up on this campus and that across the CUNY are opened up by the work that all the other campuses are doing in the realm of social mobility, we would be a different place. And so making sure that our work as a social mobility producer is conceptualized as part of a frontline effort in the preservation and the expansion of the democratic promise of this country, I think is super, super important. So that's the first thing, I think. The second thing is that I've always thought that given our particular achievements as an institution, the particular things that we as faculty have experienced in interaction with our students, and that our students have experienced in coming to the college and living where they live and living through the transitions they've made into this campus and then beyond, that we should be a place that teaches, not just teaches our students, but that gathers and draws on the expertise of our community, the lived experiences enhanced by research and systematic study about these things. And when I first thought about that, when I first became dean of the Colin Powell School, I thought, it's immigration. Like we have, and remember, this is 2013, 2014, that was the most important debate, really, is what's the role of immigrants in American society. We know what that is, right? We know what it was like back in the day when stop and frisk was a New York City crime policy. We know what it's like to have members of our classes being stopped and frisked on the way to college. And we should be in a position to tell the world about that. And so this isn't just an event that sort of talks about and celebrates social mobility at City College. The whole initiative of the Social Mobility Lab is looking for programs and techniques and things that we can do to enhance social mobility on this campus, but out in the world at a time when we desperately, desperately need it. I remember when I first started teaching at City College, which was back in the early 90s, and an older member of the faculty who I'm not even sure I knew his name back then, but he sort of said, "So you're new. Let me tell you a couple things." But he said one thing that was really it resonated, and I've never forgotten it. And he said, you may, when you give an assignment to a City College student, you may want to say, you can do this is easy. And he said, in a lot of places, when you say to a student body, you can do this is easy, that's motivating, right? I don't have to get too worried about this, I got this, right? And he said, if you do that to a City College classroom, one of the things that you're going to trigger in some portion of your students is the idea that if I'm having difficulty doing this thing, then it's another thing holding me back, right? And the idea of imposter syndrome and the waiting for, we talk about stereotype threat, all of the things that stand in the way of achievement. He said, no, don't. When you give an assignment that you think they're going to struggle with, tell them they're going to struggle with it, so that when they do, they feel like they're going through the process that everyone is, instead of being on the other side of qualification for this work. And so what I like about that story, and what I like about the way that fits into the larger social mobility, is it is a thing that we can do in the classroom. Right, is a technique that we can develop. And this is just one. There will be, coming out of this laboratory and out of the discussions you're going to have, a whole set of things that people can do at a time when we badly, badly need social mobility to create more of it. And if we can do that, then we'll also hit what I think is the highest aspiration for this institution beyond educating our students, which is to be a place that tells the world how to do the work that we have done so well for 180 years. So I'm really excited for the conversation today. Bob, thank you. I mean, the one person that didn't get a round of applause is Bob earlier, so please thank him for the work that he's doing. And let the games begin. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm just going to take a couple minutes very briefly to share a little bit about the lab and sort of level set us for what you'll see the rest of the day. The goal is essentially for us to try to, in what Vince just described, like find things that we can do in a very simple way. So we're trying to discover new ways to accelerate and expand opportunity, not just for our students and their families, but also the communities they represent throughout the country. We believe that the only reason to study social mobility is to create more of it. And yet we also recognize that sometimes within the world of academia, we're not necessarily incentivized to sort of do that. And so the model that we have is a virtuous circle, which is, yes, we're going to continue to learn. We do that through grant making, but we also learn through other people's work as well. And then we put a real emphasis on translating that knowledge into ways that can sort of inform and improve people's lives, and then engage those people who really need the information most directly. So by way of review, don't get too excited. That's like the only really fancy transition I think we have in slides. Actually, there are two more coming up. But I just want to sort of, when we first started this, and the one person who I didn't thank actually was our former dean, Andy Rich, who was recently experienced his wonderful day of convocation as president of the university at Franklin and Marshall. And it was largely through his vision and support we were able to make this happen. And when we first sort of did our first round of grantees, you'll see here, they were all within the CUNY system. The next year, we said, let's open this up sort of nationally, and you'll hear from actually all of these people here today. And so now we expanded our network. And now I'd like to introduce our new round of grantees. There we go. Many of which are joining us, virtually. What's interesting here is we also have our first international grantee joining us from Turkey. And we also now can say that within our community of grantees, our learning partners, we have representation from over 19 different colleges and universities of all shapes and sizes, and 40 individuals whose research we are supporting. And so we want to welcome this group to our family at the Social Mobility Lab. Over the course of the next year, starting in the fall, they'll come in and start giving us a briefing on what their research questions are, hopefully joined by past grantees who can sort of help form what they're doing and ask inspiring questions to generate new ideas. So welcoming our new set of grantees, there'll be an announcement with all of the wonderful questions they're exploring. One thing I will point out that I think unites so many of the grantees that we've invested in here is that there's a very specific focus on translational knowledge. like they are producing sort of experiments within their communities that hopefully produce real-time knowledge that we can then go ahead and figure out how we can implement here and in other places. I mentioned before that sort of like, you know, this work is centered on the lives of our students. And last year we decided to do something that's unusual for events like this, where instead of having a keynote speaker who's an expert in the world of social mobility in a sort of traditional sense, meaning they write about it or they study it, we thought we would sort of hand over our keynote address to those people who are experts because they're living it. And so you'll hear from two students today. They're students of mine from an economics of social mobility class that I teach, and you'll hear more about that. Johnfree, who is going to come up in a second, he's got a wonderful and important and moving story to tell. And I could say that I could have selected any two of the 30 students to come up here because their stories are remarkable, as is their effort and their desire to make the world better for themselves and for others. So give a warm welcome for Johnfree Carrasco Collado, who is going to come and read his essay from our class.
Good morning, everyone. So you know, my name is Johnfree, and I will share my story with you all today. How did I end up here? My story does not start in a classroom or with an internship. It starts in a bar in Santiago, Dominican Republic. My mom used to be the co-owner of a club, a place where people went to drink, dance, escape from their realities for a few hours. That is where she met my father, who was married, and their relationship was an affair, and I was born from that. I'm not ashamed of that. For a long time, I did not know how to feel about it, but as I grew older and understood the consequences of betrayal, I made a quiet promise to myself that I would be different. In a strange way, being born from something messy like that, it shaped one of the values that I hold most strongly today. I have an older sister. She was always very good in school, and she actually earned an internship opportunity to come here in New York when we were in the DR. Unfortunately, or fortunately for her, she became a mother of two in her teens, and she had to drop out. Just like my mother did with her. So in my family, responsibility comes early, and childhood ends early. My mother became a stay-at-home wife when I was around 2 years old. The man she married, my younger brother's father, became my stepfather, and he was abusive. I remember finding my mom crying countless times. I remember being terrified of him, and we all were. I remember playing outside and running home the moment I saw him near the house, because if he found out I wasn't home when he got home, then it would be a problem. I learned very young how to read footsteps, how to sense when something bad was about to happen. Home did not always feel safe. While this was all happening, my sister met the man who is now her husband. Funny enough, he asked her out by asking her to move in with him. We still make jokes about that. But that decision changed everything. She got her citizenship, and in 2016, my mom came here to New York. 2 years later, me and my brother followed. In the Dominican Republic, I was always, a good kid. Got good grades, I used to play baseball. And I was decent at many things, but I never felt like I truly excelled at anything specific. It was like being good enough everywhere, but not truly exceptional. And that feeling has followed me for way longer than I'd like to admit. When I arrived in New York, I went to Claremont International High School in the Bronx. It was not what I imagined school in America was going to be. There were gangs, drugs, fights, kids getting stabbed. Violence felt normal, survival felt normal, and I was always in the middle of it. I did many things I'm not proud of, things I still regret, but I was trying to fit in a place that I did not belong, and to protect myself before anyone could hurt me first. I wanted to be that good kid, but everything around me said that being good was weak. So I adapted, became harder, more aggressive, and at the time, it was necessary. Looking back, I realized I was split into two. There was a kid that survived abuse and just wanted peace, and a teenager who felt like he had to prove himself every day to be respected. And that tension defined my high school years. I was saved by one teacher, Ms. Daniel, who I love to death. I still think about her very often. She saw something in me that I did not see in myself. She believed I was way more than my environment and more than my mistakes. And I made her a promise that I would make her proud. I take promises very seriously, maybe because many of them were broken around me when I was younger. Funny enough, I have never texted her since I graduated high school because I felt like I didn't want to go back to her with more problems. I wanted to go back when I had something real to show, something that proved that she was right about me. Now that I'm in college, I have great GPA, good grades, my professors respect me. On paper, everything looks good, but sometimes it feels like that's all it is. At one point, I was almost certain I was going to drop out of college. College felt heavy. I felt out of place, and I looked around and I thought, these people belong here, and I don't. Then I met Professor Hugh Fox, who was also my advisor, and he believed in me in a way that felt genuine and real. And because of him, I stayed. And today, I'm glad I did. Around the same time, I met this guy at the gym, Puerto Rican guy named Hector. Toughest guy you could ever meet. He became like a father figure to me. Not through long speeches, but through presence, discipline, respect. Everywhere I went, people treated me differently because I was with him. For the first time, respect did not come from a place of being reckless. It came from an association with someone disciplined and respected. That shifted something in me, and I realized there were different ways to be strong. The social mobility class has forced me to think about questions that make me uncomfortable. Where do you feel like you belong? The honest answer to that is, I do not fully know. Not really in college, not fully in New York City, but I also never felt the same way when I was in the DR. So, how did I end up here? I ended up here because I survived abuse that could have broken me, because my sister took a risk and came to New York first, because my mom endured more than she could have and kept going, because teachers like Ms. Dania and my professors refused to let me become another statistic, because they did not let me quit, because a random guy I met at the gym showed me that strength does not have to come from destruction. I was an abused kid who was born from an affair. I made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes I still feel like I'm a fraud. But I'm also not a quitter. I try, and I want to do better than I was yesterday. Mobility, to me, is not just about money or education. It's about breaking patterns. My mother became a teenage mother. My sister did too. That could have been another version of my story. Repeating cycles of instability. Instead, I'm here, finishing college, and trying to build something stable. I'm still figuring out where I belong. Maybe belonging is not a place. Maybe it is a direction. Maybe it is choosing to move forward when you feel out of place. I did not end up here because I was perfect. I ended up here because in the middle of the violence and confusion, I found people who believed I could be more. And eventually, I decided to believe them too. Thank you.
You are all allowed to stand. You don't have to. Thank you, Johnfree, for sharing your story. That takes courage, takes bravery. It's one thing to say he's going to sort of write it for a class essay. It's another thing when his professor says, will you come and sort of share it in a room full of strangers? And it's that kind of bravery that we learn from. and it inspires others, and that's what you've done here today, so thank you. Belonging may be a direction, but I really hope you know you belong here. And anything you ever need, not only can you ask me for it, but I'm sure any person in this room would help you with it, all right? So thank you very much, Johnfree. I have given myself the task of following that, and so let me just sort of try to pivot and share a little bit about what we've been doing at the lab to try to accelerate some of the work that we're looking to do in terms of, again, helping more students like Johnfree find their way up. And so if you came into the room, you may have seen something called Ideas for Moving Up. And that was born from something we shared last year where Hannah, the research assistant that I mentioned earlier, she had scoured and found 100 different sort of research studies that were contributing to social mobility. And we said, could we make that more accessible for our students? And so each quarter, we basically created an essay, or she created an essay, I should say, that basically was themed around things that were going on in our campus. Do you feel like, what's happening in the classroom connection? Another one in the beginning of the year was around belonging. And basically trying to summarize studies in a way that was really accessible for others. And this would appear on our online blog, and then it would share in its totality on things like LinkedIn and Instagram. But then we said, well, it's still too long. And in the spirit of Winston Churchill, who in the middle of World War II, who was overrun with reading so much, he said, please give me the essential facts. Sort of brief, short, cut to the chase. And so this is a couple of examples you may have seen sort of coming on before, which is essentially sort of like ways in which we can sort of take research and say, what can I do with it, to Vince's previous point. So what's the best seat in the class? There's research that shows where you sit matters. And how do we translate so that can actually impact where people sit? And how does that, as a professor, encourage you to help people sit someplace else as well? Ari, who I don't know is here either, who was here earlier, but she may have gone, is one of our communications folks. And she was like, hey, Bad Bunny just performed at the Super Bowl. And I remember seeing some of the research. And some of this research is actually really related to his story. And so we basically said, yeah, he believed in himself, which is critical for working hard, which leads to sort of increasing your chances. And he also had a part-time job, also associated. So how do we sort of take even what's happening in popular culture and translate it back to the research that matters so much? You all have in your seats the Journal of Up, which is, again, featuring some of the things that I just mentioned, but other kinds of content. This was a desire to have a journal that is based in research, but not a traditional academic journal. There's nothing in here that's peer-reviewed. We were able to sort of turn around and create it in a matter of months, not years. And it is something that we feel incredibly proud about because it centers the voices we want to center. And so we had a partnership with our journalism program where we basically gave them that same data set of 100 surveys. 100 research studies, and said, find one that speaks to you, that sort of is reflective of your lived experience, and write about it. And so this is someone who's talking about imposter syndrome, connecting the paper to his life. We also sort of funded a student photojournalist who followed around a person they knew who had a lot of dual sort of demands on her life. She wanted to get into early education, but she herself actually had to take care of one of her sisters. And so created a very moving photo essay that you'll see in there in terms of, what her day looks like, what her week looks like, and the reflections on that. Another thing you'll see in here is something that we did in conjunction with Gell, a design firm in Europe, and with University of California at Berkeley. And it was this idea about there is inspiration all around us. In the world in general, but specifically at City College. But are we seeing it? And if they see it, can it help actually inspire journeys? In fact, Johnfree took my class because he went on this tour. And so, so thank you for going on the tour. And so what you'll see is we basically took students around to different stops around our campus. So the Great Hall where we basically can see sort of where City College began. The Grange Museum where student sort of basically was able to look, wait, an immigrant from the Caribbean was actually a founding father? I'm an immigrant from the Caribbean. Strivers Row, which we talked was originally a derogatory term. Which people then used it as something to inspire their own journey. Harlem, where people like Langston Hughes and Jackie Robinson mentored folks. Madam C.J. Walker, her home, the first female millionaire in our country. and the Schoenberg Center of Research in Black Culture, where we're able to sort of not only sort of see the words of Langston Hughes, but be moved by the fact that he was literally interred beneath our feet. And what's really interesting about the impact of that is that students actually sort of felt, because we asked them surveys before and after, they felt that they had a stronger belief that they could make a difference. They believed actions mattered. They felt like they belonged. And instead of observing the world around them, they felt they were participating in an experience. They felt like they were proud to be a student. They felt literally that they had people rooting them on from the rafters at the Great Hall, and that people were passing the generational torch onto them, and also a responsibility for them to do the same. If you look at the words they used to describe themselves, both before, they were cold and nervous and curious, and they were inspired and more connected afterwards, and proud to be a student, and looking forward to the things they will accomplish in the future. We asked them to draw pictures about how they felt before and after. Some would fall, the ones in the beginning were more introverted and closed, and at the end they felt inspired, literally standing on a stage graduating. Another thing that we've worked on in the context of the class I've mentioned before is, we all want to sort of write and put words out there about social mobility that can make a difference, but too often those words that are written or shared are basically for people like us, academics, people who, read books that are written by folks that even try to take knowledge and translate it into sort of more accessible ways. Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, these are all very sort of important pieces to put and make more accessible. But if I asked you when was the last book that was written explicitly for a poor young person who was trying to make it, you'd be hard-pressed to figure out what that would be. And then also asking ourselves, instead of questioning like, oh, young people don't read anymore, realizing actually they're reading 10 to 20,000 words every day. They're just scrolling. And so maybe we're not writing it in the way in which they would find it more appealing and useful to them. And so Upwards, A Striver's Guide to a Better Life was actually sort of the textbook that we are using in our class, which is being written every week for and with them. Every week they get a chapter named Dreams or Education or Work. It's almost something that could be a collection of posts, questions to reflect on their own lives, facts that they should sort of take into consideration when making decisions. And the feedback, which was anonymous, but still probably a little stilted, that I got from the students was pretty incredible. It's not a typical textbook that I have to read so many words to tell a story. To be honest, it's the first textbook I haven't dreaded reading. The chapters like Education, Dream, Origin, and Identity hit close to home for me. I felt that reading and discussing this made me feel more aware of myself and others. The most useful thing for me was how much I could relate to the text. It was a textbook that had questions about you, your true identity, whether it be what your dream is, where you want to work, etc. I loved reading each chapter as it made me emotional reading it sometimes. It looks not only fetus information, but fetus life skills and choices that you made and what you learned from that we can learn better to a better life. There wasn't anything that wasn't working for Mel. The quotes are perfect. It was perfect for me. And so, in the context of this, we're now working to sort of figure out how we get this in the hands of more people. We've already had conversations with other universities about how we're going to translate this into sort of online resources. We're going to print it and share with more students in our university that they can benefit and sort of reflect upon their own lives in language and terms that are accessible and meant explicitly for them. Obviously, anyone who's here from other universities who are interested in learning more about this would be happy to tell you more during one of the breaks. The final thing, and sort of a very meta example of sort of like experimenting, is that you're going to be asked, after hearing from two of our grantees, to sort of share your ideas by using a QR code. And last year, we just basically did it to collect. We collected over 100 ideas that we then gave back to the researchers, or we thought about ourselves that we could be doing to sort of improve things happening on campus, which was incredibly valuable. One of the professors in our economics department actually reached out to us and said, hey, we'd like to do an experiment with this exercise. Now, I can't say anything about the experiment because it would obviously bias the results. But when we get to this point, you're going to realize, a little bit about what we're asking you to do. And but I think the larger point here is that we're doing it because we're always looking for opportunities to learn and to try new things. And even taking a meeting like this as an opportunity to help someone else learn about their research is a critical opportunity for us. Okay, so now I'm going to go and turn it over to our first set of two grantees. We're grouping these loosely around themes that are similar. So the first two grantees that you will hear about are regarding family dynamics. You're going to hear from April Burns first and Julie Gressley. after. So April is an associate professor from CUNY-Guttman Community College, and we hear from Julie. She is representing The Ohio State University. And so I'm going to ask April to come up here first and give her a warm welcome. And yeah.
I don't know if I need to move this. I just want to reiterate that being up here is not easy, especially as a first-generation college graduate. But if, John, you can do it, then I can do it. Not as eloquently or as polished as Bob, but I'm super excited and thrilled to share my research with all of you today. This research is a long time coming and only made possible by the financial and intellectual support of the Social Mobility Lab. What is different about my project is that I am framing social mobility as an ongoing and specifically relational experience, one that includes the family of origin as an influence as on the social mobility process, and also those potentially impacted by the social mobility of someone in their family as well. So the title of my project is Degrees of Discordant Social Mobility and Sibling Relations. So I want to go through what I mean by degree discordance. Simply a significant difference in degree or educational attainment, here marked by the presence and absence of a four-year college degree within a sibling group, that sibling group being from a family that does not have a history of college going, so their parents do not have four-year degrees. I intentionally chose discordance because in a lot of the research on social mobility that includes research with first-generation college graduates, discord or conflict is one of those relational findings that we consistently hear. So, raise your hand here if you have a sibling, a half-sibling, step-sibling. All right, you are like more than 80% of Americans who also have siblings, so it is an important context to consider. You, I'm sure, have heard that that is the most enduring relationship that people will have in their lifetimes. We know that siblings also play an important role in the attachment process, not unlike parents. And it is one of the ways that we develop our interpersonal skills. They are often our sources of support in adulthood. Also, there is a growing and new interest in sibling dynamics currently in popular culture and in social science research. I'm thinking of the recent New York Times Magazine article in 2025 featuring siblings who are academically successful across their sibling group. So that article referenced research that talked about that attributed this academic similarity of those siblings, and a third of it was attributed to sibling spillover. So the spillover effect of one sibling's academic attainment onto the other siblings. And that third was distinct from a shared environment or overlapping genetic similarities. That research also, the research referenced also pointed out that the spillover effect can be a negative impact if the sibling group is from a lower socioeconomic status, right? Then they have a greater likelihood of staying in that status, which is not news to all of you. But everybody profiled in that article had similarly high levels of achievement, both academically and professionally. Separately, in pop culture, I don't know if you've noticed, but I have as a researcher in sibling dynamics, there's been several new series and treatments or pop culture references that feature sibling, cross-class sibling dynamics. So Sirens, the Better Sister, even Hunting Wives, all the central theme throughout is the conflict between cross-class sibling relationships. So my research kind of sits at the intersection of those kinds of dynamics. One, to bring a research lens on sort of the spillover effect, but addressing the sibling dynamics of conflict that are represented to us in more popular formats. So what is the importance of focusing on non-degreed siblings? So in previous research, I also focused on first-generation college graduates. But now I want to take a family systems approach and a more expansive view of social mobility and focus on the less degreed sibling. As our first role model, as our first peer, they still, adults in the U.S., the majority of adults in the U.S. still do not have a degree. And we see them, we hear them quite regularly invoked in narratives of social mobility. We see family and community, one of the central themes of Bad Bunny's halftime show. Johnfree referenced his siblings. So they show up in first generation narratives. Also, as our first set of peers, there is an assumed equality among siblings that is somewhat challenged by differential levels of academic and professional success. Why I'm focusing on degree status is that we are increasingly and intensely polarized culturally and politically in this country, and that is marked by having or not having a degree. A degree attainment predicts our political affiliation in a way that it rarely has in the past. And this is important because one political affiliation is especially hostile to education, institutions of education, and the knowledge-seeking endeavor overall. And it's not a neutral distinction, right? The degree is associated with a range of positive outcomes, including health and well-being, and range of relationships that they have access to, whereas not having a degree is associated with a host of more negative outcomes in terms of health and well-being and social connection. One of the most concerning findings is this loss of friendships that is reported by respondents with a high school diploma or less. Non-degreed Americans as a group report much fewer friendships than those with degrees, which perhaps puts an even greater emphasis on their relationships with their sibling, perhaps even a disparate emphasis on from that side, from the non-degreed sibling side, as opposed to the degreed sibling side, right? And it's beyond the number of friends that a person reports. Who one is friends with also has implications for social mobility. Right? Upper mobility has been linked to cross-class friendships in the research by Raj Chetty with children who have access to higher SES social connections tend to have higher social mobility rates. And yet we have fewer social contexts in which we are likely to interact across social class. Right. So this hopefully reinforces why I'm focusing on cross-degree sibling relationships as one of the few consistent cross-class connections that first-generation college graduates and socially mobile people may have. Bring me to my research questions, which are very broad. How do differences in educational attainment shape sibling relations and dynamics? How do non-degreed siblings experience and interpret these differences in status? And what do these dynamics reveal about broader social relations across education and class beyond the family? My methodology is exploratory and qualitative, which is appropriate given the very limited existing research in this area. I will be applying an abductive analysis to focus on, well, abductive analysis being an iteration or an evolution of grounded theory, which allows me to move from an unexplored area to more research questions and with the potential to have hypothesis testing research down the line. But there is a symmetry between that analytic lens and the key dynamics found in sibling relationships, which is the focus on paradox, contradiction, and ambivalence. Ambivalence being one of the inherent tensions in sibling relationships overall and in general, which it's one of those characteristics that is frequently addressed in clinical work with siblings. I'm in the middle of data collection right now. My data is semi-structured interviews with individuals, cover 3 broad areas: their educational experiences, their sibling and family relationships, and their explanations for differences in attainment. So far, my interview data has been balanced by gender. It is not racially diverse yet. It is disproportionately includes participants who are white, and on the older end of the age range, the median age is 43. So in the future, I am recruiting still 10 to 15 additional participants, focusing heavily on recruiting Hispanic, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American representation. All right, so I want to be very cautionary and preliminary about presenting these emerging themes. The themes here are taken just from their responses, my interviewees' responses on questions about their family and sibling relationships. So when talking about their siblings, they were universally proud of their degreed siblings' accomplishments. And when asked if they thought their siblings were proud of them, they generally also thought their sibling was similarly proud of them. When I posed the question of whether they thought, as first-generation college graduates have often worried in my research and other research, that people suspected that they thought they were better than them, when I asked that question, they did not think that that was the case. Maybe one person suspected that, but everybody else said no, that's not a dynamic in my relationship with my sibling. They did, however, feel judged and as less than by the general public. And in fact, as soon as I asked them about their experiences in school, one of the first things they said was to assert that they were smart, that they were hardworking, that they had academic pursuits and loved learning. They just did not like school. Oh, yeah, often participants, when asked if their siblings judged them, said no, but they themselves judged themselves for the choices that they made. And they often did say that they thought that their sibling was superior in their work ethic or their skill or some other way. They did describe their siblings as being very different from them in personality, temperament, skills, but they did not identify this as a significant source of conflict between them. This was a surprising finding that the degreed siblings were not seen as more liberal or left-leaning in relation to their non-degreed siblings. In fact, it was quite the reverse. I was surprised to hear how many degreed siblings were identified as evangelical, very conservative, extremely Republican, and in fact, political differences between siblings did sometimes cause distance, but not between them and their degreed sibling, at least so far in this sample. Another key finding across most of these individuals was that they did not live close to their college degreed sibling, and that was something that they would like to change. When I asked if there was anything they would like to change about their relationship with their sibling, nearly everyone said, "I wish we lived closer and I wish we could spend more time together." So in terms of opportunities for support, and I think this could be, hopefully there's a place in that handbook for a better life to have the voice of siblings who we could reassure first-generation college graduates who may experience guilt or conflict or concern about their family that this is not what we hear from family members, or at least siblings who have siblings who have gone to college. Many, I would say more than half, identified struggling with ADHD and anxiety in school. So that was something I hadn't looked for. So targeted support for neurodiverse students would be a helpful intervention beyond the standard accommodations, which don't help non-linear ways of learning. Future questions and opportunities. I would encourage each of you, if you have a question for this data that I am still collecting and analyzing, to include it. What would you want to know? What would you want me to ask of the data? But many of them really supported the idea of vocational paths and wished that there were more of them. And in fact, some were in vocations and trades. But if there was a way to integrate those paths with more academic pathways to increase and facilitate cross-class relationships, a side benefit could also be increased rates of social mobility. So I started this project thinking about degrees of discordance. And after what I'm hearing so far, I think I need to make a shift to complementarity. So maybe cross-credential sibling complementarity when I'm thinking about the work of Esther Perel, noted clinical psychologist, about the ways that people stay connected is through this sense of complementarity rather than polarization. So this is a microcosm kind of dynamic that we could maybe kind of export more widely, interrupting what I had initially thought only working from the perspective of the socially mobile. And lastly, framing sibling connections as a resource. I wanted to say, Johnfree, that the fact that you did not feel comfortable up here is a strength. Actually, it is a resource for you because it allows you to be both insider and outsider. So embrace that. I also want to continue to see our connections to siblings as a resource, and that they bring not just a relationship, but they're also models of learning for learning's sake, being self-taught, and persistence in their own way. So, thank you. I'm pleased to turn the table over to Julie Gressley.
Good morning. Let's give April a hand for being the first. That is a tough job, and I'm grateful she took that job. Okay. Well, first, I'm excited to share a little of the work that I've been doing with Dr. Hanks at OSU, where we've explored the intergenerational effects of job mismatch. And I wanted to thank the Social Mobility Lab again for helping to support this work. So let's get started. Okay. So we know from labor economic literature that family background is strongly tied to human capital investment on their children. And we also know that income, race, and sex are all linked to differences in educational attainment right now. But the focus on the role of population density, or also termed urbanicity or ruralness, has been more limited when evaluating international or intergenerational outcomes. Much of the education policy has been promoting post-secondary education as a pathway for economic opportunity and economic success, but we've seen a rise in the incidence of overeducation on our educated population. And that's come alongside of the increase in cost of education for recipients and their families. So this work aims to sort of explore those gaps and contribute to the understanding contextual framings behind this family background mechanism. So why should we care about this? Well, young people learn about labor markets and job requirements primarily from their families, from their parents. But most of the highly educated workers cluster in urban areas, and there's quite a bit of research that focuses on how to attract these most skilled workers to these urban areas. However, what we've seen going on with the US population, in addition to my sample, is that the rural population has cut in half. And at this point, many of the non-metro areas, or the more rural areas, are experiencing skilled worker shortages, and this was exacerbated especially during COVID. The issue of brain drain has been dominant in rural workforce planning discussions for decades. And so this has been a long-term trend that's been occurring. And so introducing the notions of stayers and movers into this framework is also fairly important. And from the sample, part of the most current sample I'm looking at, 25% of the children are actually staying. And interestingly enough, we see a similar pattern of staying and moving in urban areas as well as rural areas. And so the key questions I'm looking at are whether the children of mismatched parents are discouraged from pursuing post-secondary education, or if that makes very little difference to them, and whether the children of job-matched parents are more likely to also job match as adults. And then I want to try to understand the context behind whether ruralness impacts this outcome. So I'm just going to give you some quick definitions for how I studied this. I defined job match as a worker who has the same education level as the occupation requires. Overeducated workers have more education than the occupation typically requires, and an undereducated worker would be a worker who has less education than the occupation requires. And this is actually an undereducated it sounds bad, but it's actually an awesome thing for the worker because it means they've been able to gain their skills through on-the-job training. I use the PSID for this analysis, and I focus on the core 1988 family. And I do think that with further iterations of this study, we might actually see a generational impact. So while my study focuses on a 1988 family, I think that if I were to evaluate this again using a 1995 family or a 2005 family as the generation I'm following, I might see a very different result. One thing that was a little disappointing to me is that there's a strong marriage bias in the 1988 sample. So you see very little information about single parents, and it's difficult to evaluate using this data set for a single parent household. So for me, I'm very excited about this match method. I know it's a little technical, but I'll just sort of give you an overview. What's different about my approach here is that I use a labor expert education requirement table, which comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I brought forward some text into occupation codes, which is, fancy. I used the 1980 to 81 Occupational Outlook Handbook, and I combined for the 1988 parents. And then I used the most recent National Employment Matrix data, which captures the education and training requirements by that occupation for the 2023 focal children. Let's see. What's slightly different about this method is that I'm capturing jobs that have multiple appropriate levels of education. And so many of this type of study only will actually eliminate those and overstate an overeducated situation. And so I'm trying to adjust for that. Okay, so this is probably my favorite table. So you can see here that in the mother and father from 1988, the father has about 27% of the fathers are mismatched, and 52% of the mothers are mismatched. And using a general education level, we're seeing that 44% of the focal children in 2023 are mismatched. But if we shift down to the second half of this table, you can see that some post-secondary, among those with post-secondary educational attainment, the mismatch numbers have gone nuts. So you can see that the 1988 father had an 18% mismatch, but today the focal children have a 63% rate of mismatch in my sample. And most of those students, or most of those now working adults, are overeducated. So overall, I evaluated this with a series of models. First, I used an OLS regression to try to answer whether children of mismatched parents were less likely to pursue post-secondary education. And then I used a logistic regression to explore whether children of job-matched parents were more or less likely to have job matches themselves as adults. So overall, one of the big themes that I'm seeing just from the summary statistics alone is that the educational attainment has increased. 60% of the 2023 children had at least some post-secondary education, not necessarily a degree, but something. And this compared to about 26% of their parents. However, of those 2023 kids, only 37% were job matched. And that compared to 78% of their parents. So early findings demonstrate that mothers and fathers shape the family background mechanism in different ways on their children. And from this information, we see that the mother's education level was more strongly and significantly behaving as a predictor for the child's educational outcome. But then we saw also that fathers' labor market experiences were much more likely to be tied to the labor market realized outcomes of the child. And what was surprising was that it was undereducated fathers and job-matched fathers who were more likely to transmit job matching with their children. From our fancy regressions, we found that urbanicity was strongly linked to reduced levels of educational attainment. So as ruralness increases, educational attainment declines. We also found that county-level stickiness, so the stayers, were more likely to boost the negative pattern. And one of the interesting themes that seems to arise from this method is that the educational attainment norms are diverging from the educational needs by the employers. And so that's, So 49% of the children were overeducated compared to 19%, and that's, not a great pattern, depending on how you look at education. Part of the analyzing of this technique required me to do a standard returns to schooling model, which evaluates the return on investment of education. And what I found is that job-matched bachelor degree earners were the returns actually had fallen in half for the 2023 students, adult working children. And that as ruralness increases, educational attainment declines, and the education returns actually decline as well, so that you're not getting the kind of wage boost that you might need to justify that kind of investment. So just another point on this, that spatial labor stickiness seems to impact educational attainment, and it can impact wages at a similar level as the wage of the head impact. So that if your family head is earning, so one of the other methods of looking at, socioeconomic class for recreation is looking at wages, and here we see that stickiness has a similar scale effect in this model. Okay, so high level implications of this study. First, if more workers are using post-secondary education as a substitute for on-the-job training, are the schools actually teaching the skills that the employer needs? So if that gap between the education, like the purchased education as opposed to on-the-job training, is widening, are we getting the right skills? Are we getting it right? One way to potentially, evaluate that situation is to have improved collaboration between employers and policymakers and institutions, not just of higher education, but also potentially K through 12, to see what skills are needed for the next generation and how can we improve that investment. Can some of the skills come back to high school? And another helpful recommendation might be to improve students' exposure to different types of career paths and bring in potential employers to help them understand the right pathway to getting the job that they want, or helping them discover the type of job that best suits them, so that they can be more focused or do it, select their schools in a better way that helps improve the returns on their investments. So with that, I will end it there. Sure.
Okay, so yes, thank you, Al, for coming back up. And so here's where we are in terms of this sort of exercise I was talking about before, which requires a little bit of introduction. So before don't scan anything yet. If you are sitting from here over, then please scan the one that is closest to you. If you are on the other side of the room, please scan that one. And the only thing I ask is that when you come back from lunch, you sit on the same side of the room that you did before. Now, when you open that, you're going to get a couple of prompts, and the prompts are the ones that you see here. We want to know what new ideas or ahas that were sparked by what you heard. We want to hear what hunches or hypotheses or questions the research raised in your mind. And then is something you heard like, wow, I really want this person to know about it, either because it impacts their life, it impacts their research, or their work in some kind of way. And so while you're doing this, and this is like one of those few meetings where everyone has absolute permission to be on their phones, and so I encourage everyone to do that. I have a set quota, and until we get that quota, no one can eat. And so please, in an open-minded way, I want you to just think about what you just heard, and is it sparking anything that sort of like can help, as Vincent said earlier, like just think of more ways to engage people in their journey. And while you're doing that, I will also open up the floor to questions that you may have from these two researchers, and then also ask some myself. And so, yes, so I see a question right there.
Hi, thank you so much for two incredible sessions. I have one question regarding the second presentation. When we're looking today at the age of AI and how it's really impacting the job market, as a recent college grad, I look at other students, they're like, okay, now I have to pay my loans. And like economically, it's not being that feasible for people because they're recognizing, as you've said, that lots of times you don't necessarily need training from college, rather you need, how would I say, like on-the-job training. So with that being said, how do you view social mobility, or sorry, mental health, because I was looking at a graph that we had with college education to actually decline? Because I know this was one thing that was mentioned in the graph, but now looking at it, when you are economically stressed, this could actually impact you one way or the other. And how do you view that really changing in the long term, especially with developments like how would I say, in technology, but not necessarily impacting education fully yet? Thank you.
Well, I think anyone who's undergoing financial stress is going to have more complicated mental health outcomes. And I think that's just, we just sort of expect that that's a thing that's going to happen. I think it would be very interesting to hear more about, more research and analysis on financial stress and how that's impacting young college graduates. So I can't say that I know very much about this, aside from, it fits very nicely within the research of financial stress and how that, impacts people's understanding of their future. When it comes to AI technology and adoption of new technology, I'm personally very excited about my method and how I could use that to analyze AI going forward. But I think to understand that, I need to actually go look back and understand how frequently the skill requirements for different types of occupations are upskilling, and how that's affecting the different economic structures. So one of the reasons I chose 1988 instead of 1995 is because we saw a lot of transformation in the economy in the 90s because of trade. And that has changed the economic structure as a whole. So I do think that AI is going to have a big impact in the way that we incorporate upskilling or different skilling. And there's a great opportunity for work on that going forward. And I'll just leave it there for now, but thank you for that question.
I have a question, but is there any other questions from the room? Okay, one thing to just note, by the way, is our previous grantee, Kevin Foster, looked at sort of the relationship between mental health and educational attainment, and obviously saw the more education you had, the better your mental health was on a variety of different metrics over the course of life. And to your question, there is a point where whether you're going to see even more divergent in that moving forward, especially with issues of job mismatch. A question I had, so first of all, what I find really fascinating about this sort of research in general is how relatable it is. And so one, I don't know how many of you, there was a question in terms of whether you had a sibling, but does anyone else in the room have a discordant relationship with a sibling? Meaning that you had a generational or an educational income that was different from yours. Yeah, as did I, right? And so, you hear that research and you're thinking about it through the context of your own relationships, right? Which is really fascinating. I think that's why, especially the methodology in terms of hearing some of the reactions and the quotes are really, really powerful. And I also can relate to the research in terms of job mismatch, because as someone whose family is in a rural area, I see a lot more of that than I see around me in the area now. I am interested in terms of for each of you, you have different methods by which you're doing it, and I could also see how your methods would also be something that would be interesting for the other person's research. So with your research, I would be wow, I'd really love to hear what people said about sort of their just job mismatch and how that plays out in sort of kitchen table conversations about career, especially when it's time to go to college. And then similarly, sort of on a larger scale in terms of this issue of discordance, how that sort of plays out on a societal level. Because I think both of the things that you're examining have the potential to grow more discordance and more mismatch. And I'm just wondering in terms of as you think about sort of thinking out whether it's your research or someone else's, where it could be going in terms of to really sort of further capture the dimension of what could be happening on a larger level. And I'll start first with April.
Well, one of the things that when you were speaking, it reminded me of a situation that a couple of people reported, which was seeing their sibling take many, many years to struggle to get a 4-year degree, then not end up working in a job that was in their major or field and having debt. And they saw that as a cautionary tale and reinforced their decision or their path of not attending college. So I heard that a couple of times. Also, jobs and school are the reasons that their degreed siblings moved away. And a lot of them were from rural areas, and so that was why that they couldn't spend time together, and then they economically couldn't make it happen. So that was a loss. So it's not just a brain drain, but a relational loss.
Julie?
Yeah, and I actually saw very similar. I was thinking the very similar direction because in my own family, I have quite a few siblings in a rural area, and I'm among the first to pursue such high levels of education. And I used what I learned to advise my siblings and my cousins to, think more about the type of educational investment they were making and take a more cost-effective route for obtaining their education, maybe starting community college or something like this, and then transfer to a bachelor's degree to help keep the costs down. And so, many of my family, which it was rather large, almost nobody lives in the rural areas anymore. And it's actually very difficult for the older folks in the family because they don't have the help that you would normally see from these kin relationships and these kin networks.
Yes.
I have a question about the second presentation. So in this second presentation, you're using this concept of match, undermatch, overmatch, and my sense is that you're trying to use that term objectively without any kind of negative valence, and you're looking at this data set that you yourself didn't create, and yet in the world people are going to have a connotation, and we're going to interpret over maybe having some type of feeling attached to it under having another one. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts around how the world or those who are interpreting your data, how they might misinterpret it, use it differently. Everyone's familiar with this concept of saying, we have this generation of baristas with PhDs, and that's a bad thing, and we need to deal with that accordingly. And so given the cultural moment and the milieu and how we're having this conversation broadly, how do you deal with that as a researcher who are using these terms that you yourself didn't create, and yet you probably have a perspective and you don't want to push any people one way or the other?
So it's true that I have no judgment on this, and in fact, I actually think the term undereducated is very skewed because what I'm thinking is that this is the way things used to be. It used to be we used to do things, as a society. Job training was on the job primarily, and we did not, outsource it to universities, for example. And the role of unions in providing on-the-job training that was focused for specific occupations was very valuable. And so, I would caution the way that the terms are used. Unfortunately, I don't get to decide how they're used, but what I can try to do is provide more context behind what they mean and how we could potentially address them. For example, I would love to see a geographic moment where we can identify areas with large clusters of people who are overeducated so that we could focus on that labor with areas with labor, education surplus, so we could better use those workers rather than relegate them to jobs for which they're overqualified. Now, workers may choose jobs for which they're overqualified, or they may use education as a signal or as a job competition approach. So for example, if everyone's getting educated, then you're not that special, right? As in terms of the competitive job search market. So I think it's important to understand the function of overeducation as a means to prevent unemployment or a choice to remain in a certain area, rather than sort of as a negative consequence of your own, failures or something like this.
Yeah. So, okay, one more question. You're good. Oh, Mac, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciated both of these presentations. I have two questions, but I'll do one since we're pressed for time. This is for Julie. I was wondering how many of your participants had some college, and to what extent might that be driving some of the results? How does that group fit in the story?
Yeah, so the majority of the 2023 children, so actually the distribution of education among the 2023 children was skewed higher, but we actually saw far more of the children in some post-secondary, and that some post-secondary could be college dropout, it could be a 1-year college certificate, it could be a 2-year college certificate, and 2-year degrees are very, very popular in more rural areas. And so to focus solely on a 4-year degree sort of weeds out a huge portion of the rural population. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Great. So I just want to go back to the previous comment and make something, because I think it's important. I do think that it is interesting for us to sort of reflect on sort of the presentation of research and the terms that we use and whether it incidentally contributes to something we don't intend it to. And it's even on a much larger scale. I mean, we hear consistently that the American dream is dead, or social mobility doesn't exist, or it's not what it used to be. And on one level, these are factually correct for large swaths of the population. But when an individual hears that information, what it actually does is disincentivizes effort, which research shows. And so when you tell people the American dream is possible, or social mobility is, it encourages them to work harder. And so when we're producing research, I think it is always a good thing to say, hey, how do we feel about these terms? Do we need to couch it? Can we turn it? And be accurate to what we're sort of saying, but also realizing the interpretation goes a long way, especially when our research gets sort of condensed into something much smaller. So, okay, so we're gonna take a break for lunch. It's gonna be shorter than we planned because we're over a little bit, so sorry. I would encourage everyone, there are box lunches there and maybe some also outside. And so grab a lunch. If everyone could come back here by 12:49. That's right, I'm being precise. I was gonna say 12:50, but I think that would have meant 12:55. So come back in the 40s of your time. And thank you very much to our presenters here, and look forward to seeing everyone in 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, so if everyone can have a seat, we're going to get started. Sorry for the abbreviated lunch. Hope it is satiating enough. So we are going to kick off the second part of the day. And so what we'll have is we're going to hear from a student shortly, and then we're going to have 2 more rounds where researchers present their research and then some closing remarks. And so much like with Johnfree, Salena Dilraj is a student in my Economics of Social Mobility class. I hope that you find her words and her story as moving as I did. And again, just reflective of the lives of the students and the people who we hope to provide information with so it can improve their journey. It's a real honor to have students being centered here to sort of share their stories and serve as our keynotes. So Salena, will you please come up?
Hi everyone, my name is Salena. I'm very happy to be here and to be in a room full of very amazing people. How did I end up here? A reflection beyond the American dream. A question I've never given myself to think about after so many journeys. Let's begin. I was born and raised in Guyana before my parents got the opportunity to immigrate to the United States. That move is the most obvious turning point in my life story, but it sure does get better from there, with all of the adversity and lessons ahead. Growing up in Guyana, my family would best be described as middle class. We were not wealthy, but we were not poor either. There was stability, and I was never short of any necessities. My parents worked hard, and like many immigrant families, they believed deeply in education as the pathway to a better life. At the time, I did not think deeper into this. I knew I had to do good in school and be the best that I could to make my parents proud. After all, they are working so hard to provide and ensure I have a good life. Back home, social class was everything. People valued those who were better off with more respect, but they were very big on community. Everyone knew each other and showed up when things went wrong. On the other hand, the school system was very competitive. Being number one determines your worth. Respect, recognition, and validation were attached to rank. Early on, I internalized the message that success meant outperforming others, but come to find out, this was not the case everywhere. As we moved to the United States, when I was at the age of 12, I experienced a reset in social and cultural settings. Migration disrupted whatever familiarity and status we had in Guyana. In America, we were starting over. I entered a new school system, new social codes, and a new cultural environment. Even though I spoke English, it was different. There were still differences in accent, slangs, and norms. I became aware very quickly of the social and cultural norms, how children valued school, how they dress, what brands they wore, their neighborhoods they lived in, and how much they complained. I was surprised to see the lunchroom where we were getting food every day. That was a big shock to me. Although I was grateful, I wasn't a fan of many of the meals. I did look forward to mozzarella sticks that served on Thursdays. However, it was a very isolated and uncomfortable adjustment period. Thankfully, for 8th grade, I met one of my best friends whom I don't think I would have approached the influences around me the same if it wasn't for her. I learned to accept who I was while rebuilding and respecting the values I grew up with. As high school came along, I made a pact with myself to become better than who I was a year ago. I built my confidence, attempting to make friends with different people. I participated in class and I was able to pave my way to feeling like I belong. No one knew me. It was my chance to have a fresh start. During my senior year, I decided to graduate early, but I had no idea how to apply to college or what options I had. Luckily, I was told about Mr. Dwyer, the faculty who was in charge of assisting students with their college application. He's a faculty member I'll always remember. My parents pushed me. He was patient with me. He educated me with what steps I needed to take and helped me along the process. My parents pushed me to go to college, but they had no clue as to what the process was. I had to figure it out all on my own, but they're not to even be blamed. This is also new to them. Now that I have applied to college and selected CCNY, what will I major in? I knew I've always wanted to be an actor, and theater is my way through, but what if my parents don't support it? Thankfully, they did, but advised that I have a backup plan as it is not secure enough. I continued on my path despite having to lie at family functions so everyone saved their comments. It was understandable. My parents have sacrificed so much for me. I have to make sure what I do is worthwhile. So I decided to minor in business administration as well. As a student here now in my final semester, I'm benefiting from generations of policy decisions that made college accessible to students from working class and middle class backgrounds. In our class, we talked about how mobility is not just about individual efforts and about institutional design. I started to seek ways to find opportunities. I realized if I sit back and wait for it to come to me, it will take a very long time. I started asking around about upcoming projects to work on, and I reached out to the specific professors I wanted to work with. Unfortunately, it took a lot more than that. I had to start from the bottom to build my reputation and presence within the theater department. I got discouraged, but I decided to take a different approach. I began working on different shows, first as a stagehand, to an assistant stage manager, assistant director, stage manager. Then finally, I got casted as a supporting character, and most recently had my debut as a director. Along the way, I gained two great mentors, met kind, amazing professors, found my soulmate, and became a part of a community at CCNY. Through many of our class discussions, I can see how origin, identity, place, and belonging intersect in my journey. The myth of meritocracy, I've been pronouncing this word all day, but I don't know. Meritocracy, okay, we'll find out after what it means. But that suggests hard work alone determines outcome. I do work hard, but I'm also here because my parents moved countries and provided for me, because public universities exist, because certain teachers invested in me, because I was healthy enough to pursue my goals, because I had just enough financial stability to remain in school. Effort matters, but it is never isolated from structure. Thank you.
I can't say meritocracy either most of the time, so it's all good. And as a side, it is one of these things like, so I didn't mention it earlier, but I myself sort of grew up experiencing a lot of challenges. And it is really tough to get up and say things that you haven't said before. And I remember once being embarrassed when someone had to correct me about how to say Proust and not Proust. That basically is something that forces you to silence yourself when you don't say things in the way in which you say. So it takes a great deal of courage to sort of get up and speak. And again, a nice warm round of... You know, I selected Selena's essay also in part not because it's a wonderful and a moving story, but also because it sort of segues very nicely into the next set of grantees that we'll be talking about, which really are looking at the kinds of supports we offer and how institutions do support or discourage pathways up. And so I am thrilled to introduce Teresa Booker and Joyce Kim. Teresa is the Associate Professor from the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And we hear from Joyce, she is a PhD student from UPenn. And so I will welcome Teresa up and give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. My name is Teresa Booker, and I did, my research project is on John Jay College's different programs at John Jay College with regard to social mobility. Students at John Jay enter with very different starting points. Many are first generation, working, commuting, or veterans. And at the same time, access to opportunity is often organized through specific programs and spaces. For example, the Percy Ellis Sutton or SEEK program supports students who show college potential but may not have traditional admissions criteria. In practice, SEEK offers more structured advising and academic support. The John Jay Honors Program is a selective undergraduate program with its own curriculum and support structure, which can create clearer pathways to research and mentoring. The Veterans Program supports current and former service members through services such as admission and enrollment, support, advisement, job preparation, internships, and other applied, other employment, postgraduate employment placings. And the experiential learning courses, including those offered by the Department of Africana Studies, can also connect students to internships or other applied placements. So career skill building is not happening in just one place. It takes shape across programs and coursework and faculty relationships and also applied experiences. And so this matters because students are not moving through one single centralized path. They're moving through multiple pathways, and those pathways are not always equally clear or equally accessible to students. And that is part of what motivates this project. And this project asks how these pathways and forms of support may shape students' financial security, social mobility, and long-term adaptability, and whether they may also help reduce financial stress for students and their families. John Jay College, in case you don't know, is an urban public commuter institution, which means that many students are balancing school with work and family and other responsibilities. As mentioned, it serves a variety of students, many of who are non-traditional, and these institutional conditions matter because they shape how students engage opportunity and support and career building experiences, and often while managing financial pressures and financial obligations alongside the coursework that they have to do. And so this makes John Jay College a very strong setting for examining how mobile pathways actually operate in practice across a variety of different groups, and whether these pathways can actually contribute to financial security and social mobility and long-term adaptability that helps students reduce financial stress. So it's funny that when I practiced this, I did not practice it in the presentation mode. So these, these bullets are as much of a surprise for me as they are for you. Okay. So this is where the issue becomes more visible. Even though multiple pathways exist across the institution, it's not always clear how students move through them in ways that build career skills. Some opportunities are easier to find and more formally structured than others. Therefore, students are not engaging the same kind of support access programs. And so the aim here is to identify where mobility is being clearly organized and where it is left more uncertain or harder to navigate. And then that in turn helps frame the larger question of whether these differences for students' financial security and social mobility and long-term adaptability fits. This study starts from the idea that mobility does not look the same across programs. And each program has its own purpose, structure, expectations, so students, like I said, are not all moving through one shared pathway. So a program like SEEK is built around support and student success. Honors is more selective and often creates clearer research and mentoring opportunities. Veterans programming is shaped by transition support and service-related needs. And the experiential learning courses are built around applied learning and placement-based experience. Access to opportunity is also shaped by advising and guidance and how students learn about opportunities in the first place. Programs are designed to support mobility, but access to those is not automatic. Discretion matters in shaping who sees opportunities, who is encouraged to pursue them, and who is ultimately selected for them. So mobility may be structured at the program level, but it's also mediated through these different decision-making processes. And so this raises a broader question about outcomes over time, right? How do these short-term structures connect to longer-term outcomes, such as the stability and the career development and sustained opportunity? This table brings the comparison together more clearly. It shows that the programs differ in access point, in visibility, structure, and gatekeeping. Some pathways are more structured and easier to identify, while others depend more on self-navigation. And this matters because these differences may shape how students build towards their long-term opportunity over time. The first question of my research project asks how social mobility is structured across these programs. In other words, the focus is on how different programs organize support, access, and career development. The second question asks how access to opportunity varies across institutional pathways. And so together, these questions bring the project from program comparison to the broader issue of how different pathways shape the long-term outcomes. So at this stage, I have been analyzing program structure and opportunity pathways using program materials, mission statements, and other publicly available information. As mentioned, I'm comparing the 4 programs: Veterans, Seek, Experiential through the Department of Africana Studies, and the Honors Program. And the goal is to understand how this mobility notion is communicated across these programs. And I'm currently awaiting any day now for the IRB to approve my survey protocol and my focus group protocol. So this is what I've learned so far. So far, mobility pathways are structured, but they're not equally accessible. For example, SEEK students receive structured advising and priority registration. Honor students move through a formal research and mentorship pathway, and veterans have a dedicated advising and career connector. So opportunity is not just available, it's organized differently depending on the program. And at the same time, advising plays a key role. Some students are actively guided through internships and through fellowships and career opportunities, through institutional pathways like advising and internship pipelines, while others have to navigate those decisions on their own. And so access is not just structured, it's also shaped through discretionary guidance. Mobility is also social and cultural. First-generation students may lack access to professional networks, or may be less familiar with how to navigate or internships and career pathways. So how students experience opportunity is shaped not just by their resources, but what they know and how they navigate the system. And lastly, this creates a tension. Programs may be designed around expectations, like time for internships or familiarity with professional norms, but not all students are positioned to meet those expectations. So even when opportunities exist, they're not equally usable for all students. So as I already mentioned, John Jay College is an urban public commuter institution, and that matters for how students engage opportunity, because those students are balancing school and work and family responsibilities and commuting, it's harder to take full advantage of internships, networking events, employer face-to-face programs, and other career building experiences that are on campus all the time. And at the same time, because of the diversity of the student population, they don't begin with the same professional networks or the same familiarity with how to navigate the opportunities that are there. And so together, these conditions help explain why formally available opportunities may not operate in the same way for all students in practice. And for that reason, it's important to understand not only whether the pathways to mobility exist, but how effectively they work for students with different responsibilities, different resources, and different starting points. Mobility pathways exist across multiple programs, but students are often moving across several spaces at once: advising, coursework, faculty relationships, internships, when they can get them, program-based supports, and those spaces are not always clearly connected for them. And so as a result, the access can be uneven and fragmented, and some students may encounter opportunities through a more structured route, while others have to piece them together, as I said. And I remember, just as a footnote, I remember every year we always tell students what is available. Excuse me, this thing is biting me. What to tell students about. I'm a minor coordinator, so we always tell the students every year, and it's always shocking to me by the end of the 4th year how many students that have been with us for 4 years will say they never knew. And so that's another thing that I've been thinking about as I'm waiting to get my IRB approved. So the issue is not only that pathways exist, like I said, it's that the route into opportunity can be messy, inconsistent, and harder to navigate than it appears on paper. So at John Jay, we have a wide range of programs and advising structures and experimental opportunities in place. That's one of the things that we're very proud of. The key opportunity, though, is to strengthen how these are connected by improving visibility across programs, which is important, expanding access through advising and coursework, and enhancing the coordination across the institutional spaces that exist. This also includes developing career pathways that show how students move from entry to career outcomes, which I think is something that we're working on now. Okay. So the larger question going forward is not just where opportunity exists, but what kind of mobility it may support over time. And of course, I'm not making any claims yet since I haven't collected the student level data yet. But what my research is suggesting to me so far is that it's important for I've been changing this for the last 2 or 3 days because it's talking to me all the time. So one of the things that I think is important to note, and I'm looking forward to seeing when I talk to the students with regard to the data, is because some students are winging it on their own, I'm wondering if that actually helps them later down the road with regard to social mobility because they don't have the support. Maybe students who have been given everything on a silver platter because of the type of program they're in, maybe they falter because they won't be able to finesse it themselves. So I think that's a future question for myself, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you, Teresa, for that wonderful presentation. I'm excited to be in conversation with you all, and I'd really like to thank the Social Mobility Lab for making this research possible in the first place. Okay, so my project is called Looking Beyond the Classroom, Inequality and Mobility in the College to Career Transition. So to set up the context a little bit, research has focused on major choice as a driver of labor market inequality. So depending on what you major in, that can lead to differential outcomes based on what career you may go in. This goes to the earlier presentation on job, occupation, education mismatch. Yet, that said, students increasingly spend time outside the classroom. So studies have shown of time different scholars have looked at how students spend their time, and they found that increasingly students have been spending more time outside the classroom in social and extracurricular activities as opposed to in class or studying. So what we know, and this goes back to the previous presentation as well, is that there's really important research being done on how students interface with institutional agents. So these are professors, career services, hiring managers. But what's been emerging in my research is the important role that peers and pre-professional spaces and how much they matter, and how clubs and networks through these clubs can influence students' career pathways. And this can be especially impactful for historically underrepresented students. So national organizations such as the National Society of Black Engineers, the Society of Women Engineers, there are signs that these can be important spaces for these students. So with that in mind, I set out my research with the following questions. How do pre-professional extracurricular activities shape the college to career transition? And how do higher education institutions, through these activities, foster both mobility and inequality in this transition? So to give a sense of my research context, over the past almost 2 years, I've been researching 2 higher education institutions in a large northeastern city. So these are pseudonyms as per IRB guidelines. So one I call quote unquote collegiate university, and the other I call quote unquote metro college. And if you look here, you can see very striking differences between the kinds of students that these two institutions serve. Now, you might be wondering why I decided to design this study in the first place. And I got interested in studying these kinds of, these institutions in relation with one another for a couple of reasons. So one, I noticed in the literature in higher education and the higher education to outcomes literature, there are questions about, okay, we should study places, highly selective institutions like collegiate because they're driving inequality, they're driving economic inequality. On the flip side, I've heard scholars also say, hold up, maybe we should study places like metro because they are engines of socioeconomic mobility, and also they're serving much more of populations where they're the first in the family to go to college compared to places like collegiate. So I couldn't help but wonder, okay, so what does it look like when we study these two institutions in tandem with one another, because the reality is they do exist in the same cities, in the same places. So for the past, I'm coming up towards the end of my data collection, but for the past a little over 1.5 years, I've been conducting participant observation of career readiness activities. So I follow students in how they approach activities fairs, job recruitment processes, career services organized events. And the main lens through which I approach my research are through participant observation of 4 pre-professional clubs, 2 per school. So I looked at a financial services education club at each institution and a chapter of the Society of Women Engineers. So I picked these schools because they correspond with popular majors, and also these are high earnings potential fields, and by that I mean right out the gate from when you graduate, you're able to attain a high earnings potential job, as opposed to if you pursue law or medicine, in which case you must go to grad school. And I've been conducting about 18 months of participant observation, so this has boiled down to about 700 hours and 264 events through these clubs. Beyond, I've also attended some of these other activities, so in total I've attended about 300 so events, so I've been really following students around. And this participant observation has been supplemented with in-depth face-to-face interviews with 90 individuals. So I conduct these interviews in libraries, eating areas, other public spaces. And again, to the earlier point I made about the higher earnings potential fields, these are the majors that I study, and this is the breakdown of the number of students per institution. And of course, I'm happy to talk more about methods. And so as I've been gathering this data, I've been doing a lot of analytic memoing. So this is where the findings have been coming out from. So what I've been seeing is that the ways in which pre-professional peer cultures can structure access to key career-related resources, information, and networks. And this access can shape students' professional trajectories in ways that contribute to social mobility. So I found a number of things, but today I really want to focus on the role of what I call sponsoring societies. So these are national pre-professional organizations specifically with collegiate chapters, and these can shape labor market entry into high earnings potential fields for underrepresented students through organizational sponsorship. So literature on sponsorship versus mentorship: a mentor is someone who gives advice, a sponsor is an individual who's there in the room advocating for you for opportunities. But I found it was quite striking how these organizations themselves can allow students to be in the pipeline for these high earnings potential jobs. So while they can provide hiring fast tracks, a catch to them is that they still come with financial barriers. So some examples, like I mentioned earlier, these include the Society of Women Engineers, Association for Latino Professionals of America, and the National Society of Black Engineers. So because I'm an ethnographer, a lot of my data comes from field notes, so I'm going to read some vignettes from my field notes. So unexpectedly, I found that students at both SWE, and this is Society of Women Engineers, SWE chapters secured post-graduation job opportunities at the National SWE Conference. I first heard about students getting job opportunities at the conference in mid-February 2025 at a collegiate SWE alumni panel event featuring club alumni who had graduated in 2023. 15 students sat in a semicircle facing a projected screen showing the 3 panelists who were zooming in from the Bay Area in Seattle. During the moderated Q&A, 2 panelists mentioned the SWE conference. At the start of the event, during panelist introductions, Annika, who mentioned she was a previous president of the club, exclaimed, "I got my job at Medtronic through a SWE conference. I was an on-site hire." Later, in response to a question about how the panelists landed on the current rules, another panelist, Nisha, also talked about the SWE conference. That's how a lot of my friends got offers. I was already interviewing with Blue Origin, which is a space tech company founded by Jeff Bezos at the time, and they were there as well. I don't know why we don't send everyone to the SWE conference. People were hiring right and left. So after this event, I also was interviewing students, and I was struck that one student I interviewed at Metro, Raymond, told me about how he's been going to these conferences and kept getting internships, and now he will be going off to Boeing for his post-graduation job. And he was reflecting back to me, and he said, if you told me freshman year that I'd be working for Boeing, I'd probably say that you'd be crazy. I'm a first-generation college student. Most Boeing interns I've seen, they're second and third generation from schools like Virginia Tech. So this got me really curious about the conferences and how they work themselves. Hearing students and alumni from Metro and Collegiate talk about how they attain jobs through the National SWE Conference piqued my interest in seeing the inner workings of the SWE Conference firsthand. In October 2025, I traveled to the 25th annual conference held in New Orleans with the Metro SWE chapter. I already knew that the collegiate SWE students had successfully secured jobs through the conference, but what about the Metro students? The career fair took place during the first 2 days of the conference. Before the career fair opened, a line of hundreds of attendees formed an hour beforehand of what the SWE website calls, quote, the world's largest career fair for women and allies in engineering and technology. At 11 a.m., the doors opened and the line swelled into a sea of students who slowly began to enter. Once inside, bright fluorescent lights, the buzz of conversations, and the names of so many companies contributed to a frenetic, dizzying energy. Booths with household names had elaborate 3D structures suspended from the ceiling. Apple, Disney, Bank of America, making it feel more like a company expo than a career fair. Many of the booths had lines of students and a dozen employees wearing branded company attire. A directory and a map of the career fair near the entrance listed almost 400 companies. Walking around, I saw a red F-150 truck with someone wearing a blue Ford logo polo holding an iPad, nonchalantly sitting in the open hood while several students surrounded her. So this gives you a sense of what the conference looks like. And this is the number of companies there as well. When I spoke with the Metro SWE students later that evening, I learned that all but one of them had obtained at least one on-site interview. Surprised to hear they already had interviews, I asked where they were held. Mira, a junior studying civil engineering, had an interview earlier in the day and mentioned that the interviews took place in another hall with white curtain booths. Aisha, a biomedical engineering junior, smiled and volunteered to show me where the interviews took place the next day. And so later on the following day I went, and there's like rows and rows of booths with PVC pipes and white muslin cloth, so that's where the interviews were taking place. Within weeks of the conference, 3 of the students had additional interview rounds with companies they first interviewed with at the SWE conference. When I texted Aisha in mid-November to confirm whether we're still on for an interview the following day, she texted back, "Hey, I managed to get a final interview with Medtronic, but it's on Friday. Do you want to move the interview till next week so I can tell you how that went?" Appreciating her thoughtfulness, I agreed to meet her later on. Then the following week, as we sat next to each other on some chairs in a quiet hallway, she talked about her final round interview. Her face lit up as she recollected telling her classmates about her interview. When I came back, I said to people in my class, "Hey guys, I got an interview with Medtronic. I got most of the class listening because they all want to work there. It's one of the biggest medical device companies. And if someone who's an average student, I'm kind of average, like one of the lowest GPAs in my major right now, if I came back saying I got an interview with one of the biggest medical device companies, everyone thinks they have a chance, and they really do." The following day, Aisha texted me a screenshot of her offer email. Yeah, applause for Aisha. Before the SWE conference, Aisha told me she had applied to over 40 internships online in the last year. She received 4 first-round interviews and reached the final round for one organization, but ultimately did not receive the offer. Of course, attending the SWE conference did not guarantee a job, so by no means is this like a silver bullet. But it was striking that students from both Collegiate and Metro secured its career opportunities at the same company, Medtronic, through the same process. That said, of course, there are strings tied. While the SWE conference was open to anyone, there are financial barriers, particularly for students from the Metro College chapter. There was no application process to attend, and for students formally joining the National SWE organization meant visiting the official website, clicking the sign-up button, filling out demographic information, and paying $20. While the conference was open to anyone who wanted to attend, there were steep financial barriers. For a student, early bird conference registration was $225, with additional costs for flights, lodging, food, and local travel. At Collegiate, a SWE board member sent out an application in early July for students to apply for university travel funding that would subsidize most of the trip. The Google Form application asked students for their majors, why they want to attend, and what they hope to get out of it. Meanwhile, the Metro SWE president shared an interest form for the conference, and over the 2 months, the Metro SWE Club president created a group chat for anyone who wanted to go. Ultimately, students at Metro mostly had to pay out of pocket. Throughout my time with the Metro students at the SWE conference, there were comments about the challenges of paying out of pocket. On the first full day of the conference, the students decided to walk the 1.5 miles from where we were staying to the convention center to save on Uber costs. Although it was late October, the muggy New Orleans weather made several of us visibly sweaty after walking for almost 45 minutes. The 6 of us were either in pairs or trios talking. I ended up spending most of my time talking with Aisha. By the time the convention center was in sight, Aisha sighed. Yeah, it's like $700 out of pocket. After a pause, she continued. I really wish our SWE would get more funds. I was looking online, and some of them were fully sponsored by their SWE, and they're from Ivies. I know they have more money than us, and we have to pay. It's kind of unfair. I know so many people who would have gone here, but they're like, I have no money, I got to pay rent. Several other students I spoke with said they also used savings from their part-time jobs to pay for the conference. Only one of the 6 students I talked to told me she received financial support from her parents. Later, when I interviewed her, Aisha told me she saved up for the convention by picking up extra evening and weekend shifts at the Amazon return desk at a Whole Foods. Tracing how Aisha received a valuable career opportunity demonstrates that while in theory these conferences were open to all students, irrespective of what school they go to, their GPA, etc., the sticker price of attending these conferences and the challenges of securing financial support compared with more resourced higher education institutions meant that Aisha had to quote-unquote pay to play. So what are the implications from this? So I think something that I'd really like to think through with you all is about, given the competing claims on students' time and resources, how can there be more space and awareness for these kinds of extracurricular activities? What ways can institutions tap into peer cultures and integrate them as part of their classroom experience? And I say peer cultures because a lot of students found out about these opportunities from their other peers. And how can institutions promote awareness of these quote-unquote sponsoring societies, but reduce the financial burdens to attend these events and prepare students to make the most of these opportunities? So some potential opportunities for support. I think encouraging pre-professional club participation. I know some institutions do this, but creating designated blocks of time during the day for clubs, scaffolding in pre-professional development as part of students' career experience. Having parts of the class be interactive and facilitating group projects. I've interviewed a number of students and they told me, hey, at a place that's a commuter school can be hard to find community, but through classes, through group work, I'm able to find peers, and it's through these peer interactions that students have been able to find different internship opportunities that it seems like they would not have found otherwise. And then also thinking about, okay, what are ways in which there's potential for finding support for these kinds of hiring fast-track organizations? I think that's something that could be fruitful to think about. Great, thank you very much.
Okay, so if I can ask everyone to take out their phones again. Hopefully you're on the same side of the room that you were on before. If you scan the QR code, you'll be asked to, again, sort of share some ideas or ahas, hunches, hypotheses, questions that you have just gotten from the presentations you've heard. And I'll also open up for questions in a second, and I've got one I'm going to sort of lead with. I personally, with all the research, it's pretty clear sometimes. You can see the implications, right? And one of the things I find most interesting about this pair of projects is they are sort of acknowledging how much of what happens in the engine of social mobility that is higher education is happening outside of the classroom. And a lot of well-intentioned and really wonderful programs and efforts exist, and yet their design can be problematic. And in fact, in some cases, like was just mentioned in terms of the career fairs, can actually exacerbate inequities instead of sort of reducing them. Things like paying for a conference attendee and getting subsidized in one university and not in the other. So I guess my first question is, when you think about some of the things you're just starting to see, I really believe moving from the abstract to the concrete is so helpful, because to your point in the last example, you can really see wow, as a university like City College, we should really try to sort of raise more money for career fairs. It's a really sort of easy potential sort of solve, right? But there's something else you had mentioned too that, has even less financial barrier, which when you had shared your research previously, you talked about how clubs worked. And how the clubs themselves are designed in ways where there's a lot of gatekeeping that, again, perpetuates inequities. And if you could just sort of summarize that a little bit in terms of what you saw, in terms of people coming to sort of join up for one club and really trying to draw them in, and the other it's really exclusive and gatekeeping. And so if you could share a little bit, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, so across the two institutions, so this was primarily amongst the finance clubs. So at Collegiate, these clubs are amazingly competitive. And by that, I mean, for this last cycle, 380 students applied. There were 60 interview slots. So yes, they are interview slots for these clubs, and then 11 students get in. So this is 3% of students getting in, which is less than many college campuses. So I think this also brings attention to, what happens when this is what peers, and these are how some subset of peers are interacting with one another, and what does that mean for the future of higher education? And I think in these, I can say, now having sat in and getting the backstage access to these clubs, where I sat in on their deliberations of other students, so these are 18-year-olds coming in the second week of college and applying to these clubs, mind you. And seeing the ways in which, these students, if you are part of this, this club, I see how students really mentor one another and sponsor one another. And by that, I mean they have question banks from firms like big investment banking firms that they share with one another. A lot of times how hiring works for these kinds of firms is that there's school-specific teams. And so lo and behold, if you're a club member, you get into a junior analyst role. It becomes sort of like a virtuous cycle for a club member itself. So I think that has major ramifications for inequality. So there's this kind of gatekeeping, as was mentioned, this competitive closure. Whereas at Metro, I really saw this sense of hey, we're all in it together. We want to help each other out. There was no sense of gatekeeping whatsoever. And if anything, it's hey, why wouldn't I help you? It doesn't even cross their minds. It seems like this idea of caring camaraderie. So I don't know. I think really seeing how different institutional and peer logics, if you will, come about, I think, and how they manifest for the college to labor market transition is important to think about as well.
Yeah, another detail about this story you mentioned in terms of the question banks that sort of students would sort of compile about different institutions was that there was I think one quote you mentioned where when someone was about to share it outside of their club, just to other friends, they were admonished and said, no, that's for us. And so this sort of hoarding of information is also a real challenge. Questions from, yes?
Thank you for two incredible sessions. Oh gosh, where do I begin? This last presentation really echoed essentially my last 4 years, because not only in college, coming internationally, this experience globally is, how would I say, magnified by a lot, essentially. So how do you view it globally when it comes to providing access specifically to people? Not only you might have the resources, but you might not have the mobility when it comes to, how would I say, immigration restrictions because you're coming from a certain country. Or even for international students, you're looking at students from India or China specifically that have high populations where there's lots of competition. How do you view it as in being able to pay it forward somehow, especially when there is just very high competition, that it makes it very hard? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a tough one, and I say that, so mind you, my institutions are here based in the US, and I've interviewed a small number of international students because that is not the focus of the study, but of course, within these clubs, there are a few international students, both at Collegiate and Metro, and that's who I've talked to. I'll say a few things. I think, one, the international students I talked to, particularly at Collegiate, come from a very upper class, very, very upper class background. So they're not getting financial aid, which means they're above a certain income bracket. Like, top of mind, the students I talked to, I think their household net income when I ask them is above 1 million. So I think in some sense it's like they'll be okay. They'll be more than fine. In terms of I haven't talked to, across both schools again, I haven't talked to that many international students at both, but something that I do think about, or I do hear, is about like the visa situation, and another push to go into these kinds of STEM careers is because of the OPT. So I think that also creates funneling into these kinds of careers. Sorry, the last part of your question was around how do I think about global economic?
It's more of like competition, because even when you're looking at countries like India and China, you're competing, like there, you have people that are wealthy, so they have already resources. So it makes the competition even, like, how would I say, colossal.
Yeah, I think perhaps that is more like, that's a little more earlier than what, of course there's ramifications, but I think in what I study, like there are international students, but how they come to these schools, I talk about a little bit, but I focus more on, what they do in the institutions. But I can't help but wonder, based on what you're saying, is if that, those men, like, I wonder if that can translate into how they navigate to their current situation.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for sharing. This question is for Joyce, and you referenced that you were doing interviews with hiring managers and employers as well. And I think one broad question, I would love to hear just a little more about the themes that you've heard from them, but especially in the context of, so I know when I've spoken with students before, college students, a lot of them will say, well, I'm really focused on my academics. I really need to do well in my classes, and that makes it hard for me to go to clubs or extracurriculars, or maybe I just need a part-time job so I can't focus on internships. So I'm wondering if some of your conversations with employers have been helpful for better understanding how we can be guiding students through that prioritization and think about how to balance their time.
Yeah, that's a question I struggle with and it's a great question because it speaks to like a larger, very fundamental question of like, what is the purpose of higher education, right? And that's something I struggle with because I study the college to labor market transition. So of course, social mobility, economic mobility is like a big part of that. But then I think about, okay, so then what about like civic development? So I don't know, that's a kind of an aside on a personal level. When it comes to hiring managers that I've talked to, so I will say that I've mostly focused my interviews with students. But when I do talk to hiring managers, the landscape has changed dramatically since previous studies on hiring have happened. And by that, I mean, of course, like academics are still important and like major is important. So I definitely would not, that's important to think about. But now applying has gotten so competitive, and in a weird paradoxical way, like the opening of online portals makes, in some sense, like pushing the button easier. So hiring managers get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications. Something I have heard from hiring managers is that then how do you distinguish yourself among students who have the same major as you? Of course, institutional, where you go as school-wise matters. But I think that showing that level of demonstrated interest or experience, whether that's pre-professional clubs, whether that's internships, can really make a difference. So I think that's something for individuals, and I really love that question, like how can we best help students? I think the labor market is such where I think having that just academic background and that GPA threshold, of course you have to have a certain GPA, is not enough. And I hear that both from students, like I've talked to students who are not really involved in clubs, and they said they focused on academics, and a number of them said, I wish I were involved in stuff beyond. So I don't know, that's what I've heard from students as well. So I think somehow given this labor market reality that I've been hearing both from students and from hiring managers, like I think that's an important thing if there's a way to scaffold it, I would recommend that.
I just want to say one thing too, just to piggyback on that. So about 10 years ago in my department, we actually did have a discussion with hiring managers. And so we found out that students were saying they didn't have time to do X and Y and Z because they were commuting, and they were also lamenting the fact that when they graduated, they had no experience to put on their CVs. And so what we did is, for our community justice minor, we created several courses that have tiered experiential components. So the first level, you have to have part of your class, the classwork that you're already registering to do, you had to have 10 hours of working with some employer that was sanctioned. And then it gradually built up to, I think the last course is 140 hours. So that's almost like a practicum, so to speak. So that's just to piggyback on the thought. You can, if you properly plan it, you can build it in so that students can alleviate the excuse.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There was actually a grantee from last year's cohort who was addressing this issue from a different perspective, which was the issue of familial piety, which was the idea if you are, for example, potentially a first-generation college student and you're coming in, the pressure from your family to focus on academics, and that things like clubs or other kinds of activities seem sort of tangential or unnecessary. And so one of the solutions he had actually suggested was having back-to-school night with families when they come in, and sort of invite them to the campus where the families feel like it's a place where they also belong, and also to sort of suggest that there are opportunities where, like, this is what higher education is. It's not just what's in the classroom and a GPA, but it's taking advantage of all the different programs that are available. And I think the potential issue, if that doesn't sort of get addressed, if people don't take more advantages, it gets perceived by employers as a negative and something that is an act of commission, not omission. Which is to say that, like, we even know through other research that shows that, like, if a student in a class doesn't ask a question, or they sit in the back, and they may be doing that because it's an issue of belonging or self-silencing, that a professor can interpret that as someone who is being less engaged. And so the challenge is potentially someone seeing a resume and not look, or maybe they don't even see it because it gets weeded out from AI. They're not looking at sort of the other responsibilities with the job or with family, and they're just saying they did in activities, oh, this person is not ambitious, which is obviously the opposite. Other questions that we have? Yes.
So I wanted to make some connections with what you were saying, Bob, and also from your research, where you talked about some of the networking and the realization of opportunities happening within the classroom. And so wondering then if there's talk about clubs and having them be a part of the experience, but especially with, like, workforce Pell coming and needing things to be more stackable, are you hearing or seeing or advocating for anything that would make some of these more club-like opportunities actually something that could be credit accumulating?
That is, I think I need so what I'm hearing you say is if they would get credit for being part of these clubs. I mean, that's not something I'd previously thought of. That, I guess, to be honest, I'm not quite sure at the moment of how, and I say that because on one hand, and this goes back to the question I raised earlier when we're thinking about, like, what is the point of a college education, and it is important that students engage with their peers and they get that job, but sometimes I wonder, and it's really my experience at collegiate that informs this, it's when it's like the ends become the means and the journey is lost. I guess I get a little worried about that because I hear students say they get so fixated on getting the job that they almost seem to, that some of them have articulated to me that, oh, like, I know it's like college is important, but I was so fixated on getting the job that, like, it seemed like their experience, they kind of lost out on the experience. Although as alumni, I'll hear them talk and say, oh, this is like the only time you can really, like, explore and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think on one hand, that could be a solution, especially if we want to encourage students to, be involved in a way that they get credit. But I guess I'm not quite sure yet of how I feel when that is so focused on that job obtainment, and what are the potential trade-offs of that? So I guess that's what my thinking is there. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think an interesting sort of aspect of that too is like, how do you make some of these activities just more course adjacent, like Teresa was sort of saying, or like maybe when you're registering for your classes, that's where you can also register for clubs or things like that. Yes, I saw. For you, we have time.
Thank you. Teresa, this question is for you, and thank you, Joyce, for all that you have educated me about your research. But I'd like to ask you, so far, right, from the data that you've gathered, do you see any difference in the career resources that veterans get compared to the rest of the other students?
I wouldn't say that I think they do get, let me just answer this way. One of the things that I clearly see is that there's a built-in camaraderie with the veterans automatically. It doesn't matter the branch, it doesn't matter anything. And that piggybacks on the other research that I've been seeing and listening to today. And it makes me wonder when I think about what I hope the end result will be in my research. The goal is to determine whatever you're exposed to, will that give you enough skills so that when you've graduated 5 years down the road, you'll be able to pick up and get your own job? I'm not so sure about how if everybody's going to come out evenly. I know the veterans are going to be okay, right? The youngest veteran that I've seen has been 22, 23. There is no veteran that I have ever known that can do what my 200 level students do, 300 level students, and come in and not say hello to the person next door to you, next to you. So they already not only have this camaraderie, but they also have this thing is they're gonna, just like they were in platoons and battalions, they're gonna speak and help and do. And if they never get another resource, they're gonna be okay. I'm not so sure about the other people who I have to say, did you go to Brightspace and download a syllabus again? These people, especially the ones that have to figure things out themselves, I don't know if they'll be able to have that same type of mobility if they're in certain classes, like even the experiential one, 5 years down the road, unless they've been in the wrong class that they've had to be scrappy and figure it out themselves and go get their own position and then give it back to the professor and say, this is what I found for myself. So that's a long way to say that I have intentionally tried to stay away so that I don't do anything outside of the IRB process, but that's what I'm thinking so far, if that helps.
Okay. I think in wrapping up this session, I think what's really interesting, it does sort of raise some broader questions within the context of higher education, like these ideas of cooperation versus competitiveness and community, and sort of how that then translates in terms of availability and access to programs that are designed to create mobility, and in some cases are just not as available or as connected as we would like them. So thank you very much. Big round for. Okay, so our last set of grantees, I think what combines or links these two projects is really interesting is that they're sort of really challenging some existing sort of notions about aspects of mobility, how we measure it, how it's accelerated, that maybe are counterintuitive to what we currently believe. I also want to acknowledge that every year it seems like we've got one presenter who has a unique set of challenges that lead to their level of fatigue. And so last year we had a presenter who literally his wife had just given birth like a week before. And so he had that sort of new dad, new parent vibe. So the fact that he was able to make it through everything was great. And our first presenter today, Elizabeth Rivera, is fresh off of a red eye at another conference from California. And so I welcome Elizabeth, who's an associate professor from Montclair State University, and she will be followed by Janeria Easley, who's an assistant professor at Emory. And so, Elizabeth.
I am way shorter than you are. Is this working? Okay. Good afternoon. It is afternoon. That was the best way to introduce my entire state of being today. So good afternoon. I am Elizabeth Rivera. I am at Montclair State. This project examines how how gentrification shapes social mobility, and specifically how institutional access and responses at Hispanic serving institutes shape Latinx pathways in STEM. And I remember now. Okay. So gentrification is often framed, wow, that got louder. So gentrification is often framed as expanding opportunity, right? So we think about it as bringing in resources, investment, and improving all sorts of opportunities within institutions. But that assumes that it's happening at an equal rate for everyone and everyone who's in these areas, right? So that the people who were there before are benefiting the same way as those gentrifiers. So it doesn't really hold, that doesn't actually happen, right? This is not a homogeneous sort of thing. It doesn't just shape neighborhood gentrification, it also disrupts the pipelines that connect students to different opportunities. There are new programs that come in, there are programs that are removed. And importantly, it assumes that institutions are neutral in all of this, that schools are just kind of there and they kind of respond to some of the demographic changes, but in many cases, schools are doing a lot to attract the people who are moving into those areas. So this project starts from a different premise. I don't treat institutions as passive, I treat them as part of neighborhood change and what's happening within those schools and to those students. So the question is not just whether or not neighborhoods change, but how institutions are translating these changes to student outcomes. So it's probably the first time I saw that transition from those slides, sorry. So it's not a neighborhood change, we're looking at outcomes for this, right? Here we are. So why HSIs? Hispanic serving institutions are central for Latino education. 65% of Latinx undergraduates start at HSI. So whether that be a 2-year or 4-year HSI, that's where the majority of Latinx students are. They're also concentrated in a lot of urban areas, and these areas are the ones that are being changed a lot by gentrification, especially in the last 10 to 20 years. So the demographic change of people moving in and then the gentrification of that as well on those Latinx populations. So if we want to understand what Latinx mobility looks like in the United States, we really do have to understand what's happening in these areas, but also the institutions that are serving them. So the project asks, overall, how do HSI respond to gentrification, and how do those responses shape Latinx STEM pathways? More specifically, I look at how enrollment and recruitment strategies shift under demographic change. I look at which institutional responses might mitigate or exacerbate inequality, and I also do look at STEM trajectories and how they vary across institutional and geographic context. So very simply, my data and my methods. So I have a bunch of data sets that I merge together. I start with the American Community Survey data, so look at demographic changes to identify which places were eligible for gentrification and then therefore actually did gentrify. So there's different levels of gentrification, no gentrification, moderate, mild, and extreme. And those are layered onto school zones. So every school zone has a percentage of it that is gentrified. I have restricted access data from the NCES, the high school longitudinal study. So I actually see students who started in high school in 2009 all the way 4 years past when they should have been done with their 4-year degree. So I can see what courses they took in high school, if they went to college, what courses they took, what colleges they went to, what they majored in, and so forth. So that's really the crux of everything, because I can see where they were and how they did all of this. And then I have IPEDS data to look at institutional characteristics from the institutions of higher ed. I use a multi-level modeling where students are nested within institutions and neighborhoods. And I really look at the moderation about everything. I want to see what the institutional variation is. I'm not looking just for the average like we normally do with a regression, right? It's how things are impacted on average. So, some of my findings. So the first finding is that students in similar contexts follow very different STEM trajectories. So even when students are exposed to very similar neighborhood conditions, outcomes vary substantially across institutions. So this is really indicating that institutions are an important lever as to why students are going into STEM and staying in STEM, even though that they're coming from very similar neighborhoods. So exposure to gentrification alone does not determine outcomes. Institutional context plays a larger role. So this suggests that opportunity is not evenly distributed, even within those similar environments. So the second finding that I have is that institutional responses diverge significantly. Some HSIs respond to demographic change in ways that stabilize access, so looking at maintaining pathways into STEM. Others respond in ways that increase the stratification, so narrowing access or redirecting students into different pathways. So there's different programs that some institutions have used. Some institutions, HSIs are entitled to applying for different funding, whether that funding happens or not. I mean, that's breezing by. So gentrification itself is not the driver of inequality. The key variation is how institutions are responding. So it's not just about where our students are from, which we love to say, and it is partially that, but institutions are a very big part of this. Okay, and then third, these differences are driven by specific institutional mechanisms. So in particular, looking at enrollment structures, math placement strategies, STEM pathway designs in certain programs, access is structured, it's not earned. So it's very different a way of looking at things, right? So they're not neutral processes. These actively structure access to opportunity. I've heard of schools that are removing remedial classes and putting all students in regular math, no matter what they came in with. And yeah, we can all make that face because I can see the benefits and the cons to that, right? But people are trying to figure out what can be done to ensure that students are able to major in these courses or into these majors. So access is, like I said, structured, not earned. So some key takeaways. Taken together, these findings suggest that mobility is institutionally produced. Geography alone is not sufficient to explain outcomes. Instead, inequality reflects the ways institutions organize access to opportunity. So rather than focusing only on where students live, we need to pay attention to the other contexts and how institutions are responding to their lived experiences. So this really just shifts the policy lens, in my opinion. So if institutions are mediating opportunity, these interventions need to be part of the focus on institutional practices, not just student-level supports or neighborhood change. What institutional practices are actually helpful. So the question now becomes, how do we design institutional structures that expand access rather than restrict it or stratified even further? So moving forward, future questions, it really does set up where do institutions reproduce inequality, what institutional responses matter most, and what would equitable STEM pathways require. Because ultimately, this is where mobility is decided within these institutions. All right, it's just Janeria, right? That's coming up? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janeria Easley. I'm an assistant professor at Emory University, and I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Regina Baker and Emily Dorr, who couldn't be here. My talk is entitled Beyond the Starting Point, Holistic Mobility Among Black and White Families. So what is intergenerational mobility? I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I wanted to start here anyway. And so basically, intergenerational mobility measures how much your family starting point shapes where you end up. If your parents grew up poor, what are the chances that you'll be poor too? If your parents are well off, what are the chances that you'll be well off? And all the other outcomes in the middle. So those outcomes, looking just like your parents, that's persistence. And then having an outcome that's different than your parents is mobility. And this is important because we are obsessed with the myth of equal opportunity in the US. We think that people can move up regardless of where they start, even though we know that that's not true, or some of us know that that's not true. We're also really interested in how advantage gets passed down and how disadvantage persists across those generations. So, the problem that we're trying to tackle. A lot of intergenerational mobility studies look at one outcome in relation to another. So what was your parents' income relative to your income? What was your parents' educational achievement relative to your educational achievement? We feel that this doesn't give us a full enough picture of what social origin looks like and how it bolsters and constrains achievement in the next generation. So we're gonna combine these 5 things to get a picture of what your starting point looks like and where you end up. So income, wealth, education, occupation, and then neighborhood income to try to get a neighborhood context. These different outcomes have been studied in the literature before, and as you can see, you get a really different picture of what mobility looks like looking across these different outcomes. So if you're looking at occupation, you might say that that lower coefficient means that there's more mobility, there's more movement, as opposed to looking at something like the neighborhood where the coefficient is higher and you're gonna see people's neighborhoods looking very similar to their parents' neighborhoods. I also just want to note that there are huge racial differences in mobility. We see higher persistence for white families. Another way to think about this is that as a white family or a set of white parents achieves something in their socioeconomic status, that translates to their children more easily than what we see for black families. And this is true no matter what outcome you're looking at. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the slides. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that when you're comparing black and white families that might have similar education or similar income, they're going to be really different on these other indicators. So this just shows that for black and white families that have similar educational attainment, the wealth disparities are massive. Another example would be for black and white families that have similar income, the kinds of neighborhoods they live in are going to be drastically different. And so we want to see how these things coalesce together to reproduce advantage and disadvantage across generations. So how has this been studied before? So Blau and Duncan have been credited with, they combined education and occupation for parents to predict occupation for children. But they're a large part of why we look at one outcome for parents and one outcome for children, because they kind of advocated for this. Then you have the Wisconsin model, which added aspirations and expectations as mediators of the parent relationship, but still was looking at parent education and occupation on child's occupation. And then you have a much more recent paper that tried to get at this latent concept, so this combination of earnings, education, and occupation, but they only did this for the parent side. What we're trying to do is do this more latent status, this latent profile for the parents and the children, combining all 5 of these things. So again, that's income, occupation, education, neighborhood income, and wealth. So we're going to use structural equation modeling, and I'm not going to get too technical, but the thing that I want to drive home here is that our 5 indicators, the income, wealth, occupation, education, and neighborhood income, are seen as indicators of this underlying parent profile. And we do this for parents and for children, and then look at the relationship between the two. And then the model has these things called causes, but you can think about them as controls. So controlling for race, mother's age, whether or not the father is the head of the household, and then your race, your age, your gender, and whether or not you're married, because we know that those things impact the indicators as well. So I'm using the panel study of income dynamics, and this data set is really limited in its ability to talk about families that are not black or white. So that's a serious data limitation, and I'm interested in pursuing this with other data sets that will allow me to get a glimpse of what this looks like for other groups. So if people have suggestions, I'm open to that. Oh, I'm going to go back just a second. So we're looking at parents when the children were in the household in 1984, and then we look at the children in 2019. So about 35 years later is when we look at the children to see where they end up. And when you do this and you look at the correlation between the parent origin profile and the child destination profile, you get a pretty high correlation when you combine all 5 of these things together. So this is a standardized coefficient, and it just tells us how strongly the parent origin profile predicts the child destination profile. For every 1 standard deviation difference in parents' holistic status, children's status differs by 0.63 standard deviations. This is a strong relationship, so essentially it tells us that your family starting point substantially shapes your position as an adult. I'm going to come back to this slide. I'm going to go here first. So we break the sample up into Black families and white families to see what the differences are. And what you see is that there's lower persistence for Black families, but that's not, which means there's more mobility. But that's not necessarily a good thing because there's largely more downward mobility, and also when there is movement, they're not moving as far because the distribution is constrained. Among white families, the latent parent profile is a very strong predictor of your adult child status. So as white families achieve, they're more likely to transmit those achievements to their children in the next generation. This is just a descriptive picture of where people are when they're living with their parents. And as you can see, in the bottom quartile, we have a large number of Black children and a much smaller number of white children. And then when you look at the top quartile, it flips. So they're living in drastically different worlds when you move beyond income and look at some of these other indicators. Where do they end up? As you can see, there's a large number of Black children. If you look at the red bar, these are children who were born in that first quartile and end up stuck in that first quartile when they're adults. On the other end, for white families, you see this dark blue bar tells us that there are a large number of white children who were born in the top quartile and stay there as adults. And now I'm going to go back to, there is some good news, I promise. So this is a slightly different model that we use. It's called a mimic model, where we map the parent characteristics directly onto the child profile. And that tells us how important the parent characteristics are. Two things emerge from this. One, as you can see, all the child indicator loadings tell us that the child's achievement is more important than the parent's achievement. So there is a lot of room for people to achieve and move beyond what their parents do. The other thing that I think is important to take away from this is that parents' education is the strongest predictor. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, especially for the students in the room, that you're already doing something that's going to provide dividends to the next generation. So I wanted to highlight that. Okay. So findings. So this is just, I think that this suggests that looking at the full picture, family background is a really strong predictor of adult-child attainment, though there are racial differences. And looking at only one measure really misses the full story. Black and white families are essentially living in two different worlds. You get a much bigger picture of what inequality looks like when you move beyond income, for example. White persistence is very high. So for white families, parent profile is a very strong predictor of the child profile. And advantage and disadvantage accumulate differently across race. And I'm not going to spend too much time because this point is kind of technical, but it's just the fact that the Black and white families are also on different distributions, and that's something you have to account for when you're modeling this. So some of the takeaways. So again, parental status matters a lot, and in particular parental education, but your own achievements do matter more. Your education is going to pay dividend for future generations. I really want to put emphasis there. And then the last takeaway is that when we talk about income poverty, we're only capturing a very small slice of the picture in terms of this racial inequality. And I also just wanted to show that we have this theoretical piece, so if anybody's interested in learning more, it kind of outlines our argument for why we think measuring this is important. Thank you.
Okay, so this is your last crack to share some brilliant ideas. I hope you can take a minute and open up your phones, share what you just thought about what you heard. Again, we're looking for new ideas or ahas that were sparked, hunches, hypotheses, or questions. and what you heard that you want to share with someone else. Again, we'll be collecting these, we'll be sharing back to each of the researchers, so it helps inform their work in general, but we'll also be sort of sharing it internally with our Office of Student Success or other folks like that to figure out sort of like what implications might there be for what we heard and how we can support students and their communities and their families. And so I'm going to open it up to a last round of questions while you're sort of typing away. And while I'm waiting for some hands to go up, I guess I will, I'll start. I want to just sort of, maybe this is an origin story for each of your pieces of research, right? Because I think, as I mentioned before you started, was it is refreshing when we challenge conventions, right? And Elizabeth, in your research, it's like, oh, gentrification must be good, and institutions must respond in uniformly wonderful ways, or how many times have we cited individual sort of social mobility things that are just sort of like off of one metric, right? And so I'm just curious for each of you, like, what was your own sort of like aha or moment of inspiration where it's like, I want to look at something a little different?
This is something that I meant to say, but I was so worried about time. So I grew up low income, and that's a part of why I'm very inspired by this research and want to do this. And so that was the kind of the starting point and the motivation for wanting to look at holistic mobility and thinking about my own family story and where we lived, what our lack of wealth looked like, and things like that. So that was the motivation.
Mine is not that different. I grew up low income in New York City. I started in Head Start, and then I ended up at one of the elite private schools for high school here. So I have seen all of the things. I was obviously on financial aid, but I have been a part of different aspects of education, especially in New York City and in the urban area. And I've seen how other people, like in my family, what schools they've gone to and how much that's impacted them. So that's pretty much why.
It's wonderful. Just as an observation, so as I mentioned before, I too grew up in sort of similar kinds of environments with different kinds of challenges, and a lot of the work that we're doing at the lab is sort of extension of questions of like, how did I end up here? And how does anyone end up anywhere? And I do think that sometimes when we're able to sort of lead with a little bit of that vulnerability and share our own stories, it's sort of inspiring for others to do the same. And so thanks for that. Questions from the audience? Norma?
Thank you for this wonderful panel. Some of your work I'm familiar with, so it's a pleasure to see you here. I'd like to ask Elizabeth, I want to start with your research. Do you find that Hispanic institutions are sort of part of the reproducing inequality when gentrification happens? And you looked at STEM, access to STEM or graduation from STEM among students. Do you have any other insights about non-STEM? If the inequality that is created is similar or the same or lower in non-STEM fields? Please.
Okay, so I'll start with the STEM part. I've only looked at math trajectories. It's really easy to see where people should be with math, like where they should end in high school in order to get to a really intense college, right? And you know where you need to be not to take remedial courses. And then there's the trajectory within higher ed where depending on which major you're in, what that looks like. Those are really easy to do. It's really hard to do with the humanities to see where you should be. Because you don't need to graduate from high school having taken algebra in order to be an engineer, right? For humanities, you could major in philosophy and have never taken philosophy in high school. Very different pathways. So it's harder for me to focus on that. So no to that part. I am going to expand it to sciences also, because that's also an easier way to look at it. And now I forgot what your first part of your question was. I should write it down. I do not have data on leadership. I actually, I I'm starting a new grant. I just got a new Spencer grant from the Racial Equity to extend this work, and part of it's qualitative, which is terrifying because I am a quant scholar, but sometimes you need to know the why, right? And if no one else is gonna do it, I guess I have to. So I am looking at particular programs that are highlighted in Excellencia and in certain universities that I work at an HSI. Montclair is an HSI. There's HSIs in New York City. So there's certain that are here, and I want to make sure that I expand it, that it's not just East Coast HSIs, because we're all serving different populations across the country.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, there you go.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentations. I have a question for Professor Rivera. I was wondering how to understand your findings in the light of other literature that explains that geography matters as regards to social mobility and education, particularly because of the way that schools are funded with property taxes. So, for example, I'm curious for the Hispanic serving institutions, like what is the source of funding of these institutions, and if part of the difference in their responses has to do also with differences, if their differences in their responses has to do with differences in their resources. Thank you.
So the way that HSIs aren't funded equally across. So it's not like HBCUs that they have funding from a certain land grant. HSIs become HSIs based off the number of students you need 25% or more of your undergraduates to be Latino. And that is the threshold, and that's essentially it. You can be a public school, a private school, 2-year, 4-year, that's it. You are eligible to apply for funding, but there's no like special funding stream, so it depends what sort of school you are. Rutgers, Montclair, New Jersey, we're funded partially by state funds because we're state schools, but tuition and all that good stuff, just like private schools. No huge endowments, just those are the differences, but there's no straight funding, like it's not the same across any of the HSIs. And they're very different depending on how many they're serving and how like large those schools are. There's way bigger HSIs out there than, like there's small ones, there's large ones, so no consistency. Same way like K-12 education, right, the way that that's funded. So there are things when we're looking at geography that make sense, but I think a lot of that geography, those results when we're looking at, not that I think, I know because I have done this research, where we look at a lot of our groupings as very homogeneous when they're not. So looking at Latinos when we're black and white and brown and yellow, and from, any, like various parts of the world, various generations. So I think a lot of the work has looked at a lot of the groupings as homogeneous instead of separating them out. So that's part of what's happening when I look at geography, that the Hispanic serving institutions in Texas are not serving the same students that New York City is. And that's just how demographics work in the States.
Yes.
My question is for Janeria. I think it's a double question. I understand from your presentation that stickiness is greater among whiter family, and white parents have an easier time transmitting whatever achievements they have to the next generation. Does this stickiness exist also for poor white families in the sense that their offsprings are also likelier to remain poor? So that would be one. The second one is, do you have through your data a way of exploring reasons for those differences? I mean, obviously, structural racism, for lack of a better or clearer term, could come to mind as an explanation, but I'm not sure how that could maybe be reflected.
So to tackle your first question, so there is some stickiness for white families at the bottom, but this is why just looking at the correlation can be a little misleading, because we saw that there was more stickiness at the bottom for black families. And so when you put them on the same distribution, you get kind of like a slightly different result compared to when you separate them. When you separate them, black families look like they're moving a lot, they're just not moving as far. if that makes sense. And then, so we are working diligently on another proposal. We got like a revise and resubmit, so it's got like a ways to go. But we were hoping to capture like residential segregation as one way of indicating structural racism, because I do think that's a lot of what's going on. What's happening is that the Black children are, for a lack of a better way of saying this, are kind of on their own. And the inequality is being regenerated in each generation. So, some of it's being transmitted, but a lot of things are happening contemporarily that are limiting the achievements of the Black children.
So before we move to our closing remarks, I just wanted to ask one more question. Within the lab, we're trying to create a little bit of a community amongst different people doing research at different institutions, but you have a community within your own grant where there's 3 different institutions that are represented. I'm just curious in terms of like how that sort of collaboration happened and what the benefits of it have been.
Yeah, well, it's like, I'm at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but we originally met when I was a assistant professor at University of Pennsylvania. And Janeria actually was a postdoc there. So that's how our relationship started. And, you know, she came to me and we talked about this potential project. So that's kind of how it kind of unfolded there. And then
then I was on Emily's committee when she was at Emory, and so before she moved to be a postdoc at Harvard. So I've just been picking people up along the way.
That's great. Well, thank you. A big round of applause for our last 2 grantees to chat. So this will be the last time you hear from me because I'm going to turn it over to Dean Ostfield in a second. But I did want to sort of one last time say thank you very much for all of our grantees who presented today and sharing their work and their learning at the various stages. So thank you to all of you. Thank you also to our 2 student speakers today. The tech crew back there, this was, very seamless. Everyone who attended today or who registered or who's online, you'll be getting a video with all of the remarks today. As a special bonus, what you'll hear when you leave and when you heard when you came in was a playlist that was created by our students in our class, and each of those songs represents their articulation of their journey. And so it is an eclectic and wonderful mix of music, and hope you enjoy that. So without further ado, I want to sort of introduce Dean Marc Ostfield to come up and close us out for the day. Thank you for your ongoing support for the lab, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Bob. It's good to be here. Bob told me I shouldn't talk for more than an hour and a half. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. Good afternoon. As we close today's summit, I want to reflect briefly on what's been accomplished here and on the context in which all of this work takes place. You all know this. The purpose of the Social Mobility Lab is to better understand the myriad factors that contribute, or don't, to a student's experience with social mobility. Much of that information already exists, but it remains hidden, often behind sort of academic disciplines or jargon specific to those, or behind paywalls in academic journals. So the work of the lab aims to democratize the access to this information so that it gets to the people who can benefit the most from it. The newly created Journal of Up, which Bob highlighted at the very beginning, you all had on your chairs. I had a chance to read it over the weekend. It's a direct measure of how seriously we take that charge, publishing work that otherwise might not reach the audiences who need to read it and to hear it. As Bob said this morning, the only reason to study social mobility is to create more of it. As I was thinking about this summit today and Bob's request that I come in and deliver closing remarks, I was actually reflecting on a memoir that a friend and colleague of mine just published within the last couple of months. Some of you may know I just started here about 12 weeks ago. I came from the federal government, from the U.S. Department of State. and one of my colleagues of many years in the State Department, Carmen Cantor, originally from Puerto Rico. And Carmen wrote a memoir, the title I have to read, The Ambassador, Two Hats, Two Presidents. And what Carmen reflected on was her, she would not like me saying this, 30-plus year career in public service, but she reached some very impressive pinnacles. U.S. Ambassador to Micronesia in the Pacific and Assistant Secretary of the Interior of the U.S. Department of the Interior. What Carmen talks about, she talked about this with me over the course of our friendship, as well as in her book, coming from very modest beginnings, born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, English was not her first language. She actually dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Carmen loved sci-fi, not diplomacy. And she grew up in a family that emphasized, if you're going to change anything, it's going to be through education. She didn't come from elite or well-connected circles. And what she said, and she says it in her book, is that becoming an ambassador was so pie in the sky, she could not even imagine it. She describes a career that encountered multiple obstacles, being passed over for a promotion because of her accent and her background, and navigating bias in large systems and large bureaucracies based on ethnicity or gender. Her central argument is why I thought of her book today as I thought about this summit, and it is that background is not destiny. And that's very much what we're talking about here. As she sees her life, her humble beginnings are an advantage, not a limitation, because what they did is they cultivated resilience, cultural awareness, and above all, persistence. And her guiding ethos, a phrase many of us know, sí se puede, for those who don't speak Spanish, yes, it can be done, or yes, you can, or yes, we can, but a belief in possibility despite structural obstacles or limitations. So, I got to read Carmen's book. I actually wanted to bring it, and then I realized I read it on a Kindle, and we don't have the era where I can just hold up the book and show it to you. But I've been thinking a lot about her. She's now working at the United Nations, so I'm hoping to get her up here. And I thought a lot about her as I sat with our valedictorian and salutatorian candidates for the upcoming Colin Powell School graduation. And I went into those conversations, because I'm still getting to know a lot of our students, expecting to be impressed by their academic accomplishments. I mean, they're the candidates for valedictorian and salutatorian, of course. But what stood out for me even more, though, was the fuller picture of their paths, that circumstances of their lives presented not as hardship, but simply as the facts of their lives, similar to the kinds of things you guys shared this morning. That resolve, that belief, sí se puede, is exactly what this institution was built to recognize and cultivate. And it's exactly what we've been hearing today. You heard it from President Vince Boudreau this morning. City College makes a very specific promise that the circumstances of one's origin need not dictate the trajectory of one's life. The Social Mobility Lab, then, is an important part of how we honor that promise, translating lived experience into research, research into policy, and policy into measurable change. That's what it means to lift leaders, shift power, transform society. On behalf of the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership, I thank you.